Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was July 26th, 1996. I know the date because it was 3 days after my 11th birthday, and we were on our weekend camping trip in the Unaka mountain range in East Tennessee. Dad had given me a pocket compass as a birthday present, and I couldn't wait to try it out. My name is Rupert Matthews. Back then, I was just a skinny kid with a bowl cut and knobby knees who loved exploring the woods. My family wasn't rich. Dad worked at the lumber mill in Johnson City, and Mom cleaned houses. We couldn't afford trips to Disney World or beach vacations like some of my classmates. Instead, we had the mountains. Nearly every weekend, we'd pile into our rusty blue Chevy station wagon and head out to different spots in the Appalachians. That weekend started like all the others. We drove about 2 hours from our home in Elizabethton, bouncing along dirt roads until Dad found a spot he liked alongside a creek. We set up our canvas tent, built a fire ring, and hung our food from a high branch to keep bears away. "Don't go too far, Rupert," Mom said, as I fastened my new compass to my belt loop. "Be back before dark." "I will," I promised, already planning my route upstream. The forest that afternoon was alive with summer sounds, cicadas droning, birds calling, and the constant gurgle of the creek. I followed the water, hopping from rock to rock, occasionally checking my compass just to see the needle swing. The July heat made my t-shirt stick to my back, but under the tree canopy, it wasn't too bad. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I heard a branch snap somewhere ahead. I froze, thinking it might be a deer. Dad had taught me to move quietly in the woods, so I crept forward, careful not to make noise. About 50 yards ahead, through a gap in the trees, I saw him. A man, but not like any man I'd ever seen before. He was dragging something, a deer carcass, with one hand like it weighed nothing. The deer was a good-sized buck, probably 150 pounds. Yet this man pulled it along with the casual ease of someone carrying a grocery bag. I ducked behind a fallen tree, my heart suddenly pounding. The man looked wrong. His clothes were barely clothes at all, just ragged, filthy scraps that might once have been shirts or pants. His hair hung past his shoulders in matted clumps, and his beard was so long and tangled it had formed knots that swung when he moved. His skin was deeply tanned, almost leathery, and caked with dirt, but what really caught my attention was the absence of any weapon. No rifle, no bow, nothing. How had he killed that deer? And the way he moved through the forest, silent, smooth, alert, reminded me of the nature shows I sometimes watched on TV. He moved like an animal. When he disappeared into the trees, I waited 5 full minutes before heading back to camp, my exploration forgotten. That night, I didn't tell my parents what I'd seen. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, to be honest. Maybe it was just a hunter with unusual clothes. Maybe he'd left his gun somewhere else. There had to be a normal explanation. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. After breakfast, I told my parents I wanted to explore again. "Don't go too far," Dad said, busy fixing a tier in our tent. "Take your whistle in case you get lost." I patted the plastic whistle hanging around my neck and headed out, this time moving in the direction I'd seen the strange man go. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe tracks, maybe the remnants of his hunt. What I found was much worse. About 2 miles from our campsite, the terrain grew rockier as the creek cut through a small ravine. I scrambled up one side, using tree roots as handholds, and at the top, I spotted an opening in the rock face, partially hidden by bushes. A cave. I'd never explored a real cave before. The entrance was about 5 feet tall, forcing me to duck as I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the cool air raising goosebumps on my arms. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. A faint glow came from deeper inside. Not daylight, but something flickering. Firelight. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct told me to leave, but 11-year-old boys aren't known for their good judgment, and I crept forward, drawn by curiosity stronger than fear. The cave widened as I moved deeper, forming a tunnel that sloped gently downward. I smelled smoke, and underneath it something else, a musky, unwashed odor mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The firelight grew stronger, and I heard voices, not words I could understand, but definitely human sounds, low and guttural. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, and I pressed myself against the wall, peering around the corner into a scene that still haunts my nightmares. A fire burned in the center of the cave, smoke rising toward a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Around it sat 5 people. The man I'd seen yesterday was there, his massive shoulders hunched as he tore at something in his hands. Beside him sat an older man, bald on top, with a fringe of white hair around his ears and a beard that reached his waist. His back was curved into a permanent stoop. On the other side of the fire sat a woman. Her hair was the most striking thing about her, matted into rope-like strands that pooled on the ground around her, so long she must have been growing it for decades without cutting. Her face was gaunt, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight. 2 young boys, maybe 5 and 7 years old, crouched nearby. They were completely naked, their skin smeared with dirt and soot, their hair tangled and wild. They were fighting over something, a piece of meat from the deer carcass that hung suspended over the fire. The deer had been skinned and gutted, its flesh darkening as it cooked. The cave walls were covered with animal hides, dozens of them, stretched and dried, creating a patchwork of fur and leather. I recognized deer skins, the distinctive pattern of rabbit pelts, the broad shape of beaver, and the dark mass of what could only be black bear. Crude tools lay scattered about, stone objects with sharp edges, wooden spears hardened by fire, containers made from gourds and animal bladders. But what made my blood run cold was the pile at the far side of the chamber. Bones. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bones, stacked in a mound taller than me and twice as wide. Most were clearly animal remains, deer leg bones, rib cages, skulls of various sizes. But mixed among them, unmistakable in its shape, was a human skull. I must have made a sound, a gasp or whimper, because suddenly all 5 heads turned toward me. For one frozen moment we stared at each other. The woman made a sharp, clicking sound. The older man rose to his feet with surprising quickness. The 2 boys scrambled backward like crabs. The big man stood up, and I saw just how massive he was, at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders twice the width of my dad's. He shouted something in a language I'd never heard, a series of harsh sounds that reminded me of branches breaking. Then he lunged toward me. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, scrambling back through the tunnel, tripping and falling, scraping my palms and knees on the rock floor, but barely feeling it. Behind me, I heard footsteps and those terrible shouting sounds. I burst out of the cave into sunlight, gasping for breath, and plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush without any thought of being quiet. I don't know how long I ran. Everything was a blur of green leaves and panic. At some point, I realized I wasn't being followed anymore, but I kept running until I finally broke through the trees into our campsite, where Mom was hanging wet clothes on a line between 2 trees. "Rupert! What on earth?" She stopped when she saw my face. "What happened? You're bleeding!" I collapsed onto the ground, lungs burning, and blurted out everything. The strange man with the deer, the cave, the family living inside, the pile of bones with the human skull. Mom's face went pale. She called for Dad, who was down by the creek filling our water jugs. "He's making this up," Dad said when Mom repeated my story. "Rupert, is this some kind of joke?" "No!" I was crying now, both from fear and frustration. "I swear to God, Dad, I swear on the Bible. There are people living in a cave and they're not normal people. They've got bones, human bones, and they chased me." I think it was the swearing on the Bible that did it. We weren't super religious, but Dad knew I understood the seriousness of such an oath. He looked at my skinned knees, my torn shirt, the genuine terror on my face. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let's pack up. We'll head into town and tell the ranger station what you saw." We started gathering our things, Mom working quickly, her movements jerky with fear. Dad kept looking at the tree line, his jaw tight. I was helping fold the tent when Mom screamed. They stood at the edge of our campsite, the big man and the older one. In daylight, they looked even more terrifying. The older man's skin hung in loose folds, like leather that had been soaked and dried too many times. The big man's eyes were dark and intense, never blinking as he scanned our camp. Each held a spear, wooden shafts with stone heads bound with what looked like animal sinew. "Get in the car," Dad said, his voice low and steady. "Now." We left everything, the tent half folded, our cooler, the sleeping bags, and back toward the station wagon. Dad kept himself between us and the men, fishing the keys from his pocket without looking. The two men watched us, not moving but not leaving either. Mum fumbled with the door handle, finally wrenching it open and shoving me into the back seat before climbing in herself. Dad got in last, started the engine, and reversed so fast we fishtailed, sending gravel flying. As we pulled away, the big man stepped into our campsite and picked up one of our aluminum cooking pots, turning it over in his hands with curious intensity. We drove straight to the ranger station in Hampton, where Dad reported what had happened. The rangers looked skeptical but took our information. They promised to send someone to check it out, but I could tell they thought we were exaggerating or mistaken. "Probably just some homeless folks," one ranger said. "We get them in the national forest sometimes. They don't usually bother anybody." "These weren't homeless people," I insisted. "They've been living wild for a long time. They didn't speak English, and there was a human skull in their bone pile." The rangers exchanged looks. "We'll look into it, son," one said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe me. We drove home in silence, the mood in the car a mix of shock, fear, and, from Dad, embarrassment at having left all our camping gear behind. I sat in the back seat, watching the mountains through the window, wondering about the family in the cave. How long had they been there? Where had they come from? How had they learned to survive like that? Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with what I'd seen. I checked the local newspaper every day, waiting for a story about wild people found living in the mountains. Nothing appeared. I asked Dad if he'd heard anything from the rangers. He hadn't. "Maybe they were just some backwoods folks playing a joke," he suggested one evening, but his eyes didn't meet mine when he said it. We never went camping again after that. Dad sold our tent and sleeping bags at a yard sale that fall. When friends asked why we'd stopped our weekend trips, my parents would say they'd gotten too busy with work, or that I was getting involved with sports at school. The truth was, none of us felt safe in the mountains anymore. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up from nightmares about the bone pile in the cave or the way the big man had watched us drive away, studying our car like he was memorizing everything about it. Years passed. I grew up, went to college at East Tennessee State, got a job in Knoxville. I told the story a few times to close friends, usually after a couple of beers, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. I started to wonder if I'd somehow exaggerated the whole thing in my mind, made it scarier than it really was. Then, in 2008, I read a newspaper article that made my hands shake so badly I spilled my coffee. 2 hikers on the Appalachian Trail had gone missing near Unaka Mountain. Search parties found one of their backpacks torn open, the contents scattered. There were unusual footprints at their campsite, barefoot but large, alongside others that looked like they'd been made by someone wearing crude moccasins. The article quoted a local historian who mentioned old legends about wild folk in the Appalachians, people who had retreated deep into the mountains generations ago, living off the land and avoiding contact with the outside world. Most experts dismissed these stories as mountain folklore, the historian said, but some believed isolated groups might have survived in the most remote areas, becoming increasingly primitive with each passing generation. I wanted to call the authorities, to tell them what I'd seen as a child, but I knew how it would sound. A grown man claiming to have encountered feral humans 12 years earlier. They'd think I was looking for attention, or that I'd been influenced by the newspaper story. So I've kept quiet, but I've never forgotten. Those people weren't Sasquatch or deformed mountain men from horror movies. They were humans who had adapted to a life most of us can't imagine, living in darkness, hunting with primitive weapons, speaking a language evolved in isolation. I don't know if they were dangerous by nature or just protecting their territory. What I do know is that the wilderness holds secrets deeper than most people realize. Sometimes when I look at the mountains from my apartment window in Knoxville, I wonder if they're still out there. The big man with the knotted beard, the woman with floor-length hair, the two wild boys who by now would be grown men themselves. I wonder if they're watching the lights of our cities expand year by year, retreating further into the dark places where people like us don't go. And I wonder how many others like them might still be hiding in the remote corners of this country, living the way humans did thousands of years ago, watching us from the shadows of the trees. Story 2. The fog rolled in thick that February night. My headlights carved weak tunnels through it, barely illuminating 20 feet ahead of my GMC Sierra. Route 122 winded through Sheffield like a black snake, slick with winter moisture. I kept it around 35, maybe 40 tops. Couldn't risk more in these conditions. I checked my watch, 11:48 p.m. Late, but not unusually so for me. The radio played some forgotten country tune, volume low. Just background noise to keep me company on the lonely drive home. A pair of headlights appeared in my rear view, moving fast. Too fast for this weather. The vehicle closed the distance between us in seconds, riding my bumper close enough I couldn't even see its headlights anymore, just the glow washing over my cab. Jesus Christ, I muttered, tapping my brakes lightly to signal them to back off. They didn't. Instead, the driver swerved into the oncoming lane and gunned it past me. No turn signal, no courtesy flash. Just reckless speed as they disappeared up the hill ahead, taillights swallowed by the fog within seconds. "Asshole," I said to no one. "Good luck with that." The road began its descent down the steep hill that leads through the marshy woods. Dense trees lined both sides, branches hanging low like gnarled fingers. This stretch always made me uneasy, even in daylight. Tonight, with visibility so poor, it felt downright eerie. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward slightly, as if those extra inches might help me see better through the soup outside. That's when I noticed them. Two red glints caught in my headlights, one low near the white line at the road's edge, the other about 10 feet away, positioned higher. Reflectors on a sign, maybe? But there weren't any signs on this stretch. My first thought was a moose. We get them sometimes, and they're dangerous as hell on the road. I eased off the gas, slowing from 40 to about 30, then 25. Better to be cautious. A moose collision could total my truck and me along with it. The reflections didn't move like you'd expect from animal eyes. They remained fixed, steady. As I drew closer, the fog parted just enough for my headlights to catch more than just those glinting eyes. What stood at the roadside wasn't a moose. It wasn't a deer or a bear or anything I recognized from Vermont's wildlife. The creature stood upright on two legs. Its body was covered in long brown hair, shaggy and thick, about 5 inches in length. Not fur exactly, more like hair. Human-like, but not human at all. I've lived in Sheffield my whole life. I know every animal that roams these woods. This wasn't one of them. My truck slowed to a crawl, maybe 15 knees/per. I couldn't look away. My hands went cold on the steering wheel. The smaller one, yes, there were two of them, stood about 6, maybe 6.5 feet tall. It was directly beside the road now, perhaps 4 feet from my passenger door as I approached. The second one, the one whose eyes I'd spotted higher up, stood behind the first. Taller, much taller, 7, maybe 8 feet. It towered over my truck, and I was riding high in the Sierra. "What the fuck?" I whispered, my breath fogging the window. Curiosity overrode my fear for a split second. I hit the button to lower my passenger window, thinking maybe I could snap a quick picture with my phone. The window slid down with a mechanical whir that sounded impossibly loud in the night stillness. That's when I heard it. A growl that started low in the throat, rumbling like distant thunder. It built steadily, increasing in volume and intensity until it resembled a rolling snare drum, aggressive and warning. The sound didn't belong to any animal I knew. The closest creature, the smaller one, turned its head toward my truck. My headlights fully illuminated it now. Its face was obscured by the long hair, but I caught glimpses of dark skin beneath. It moved with deliberate, unhurried steps. Not frightened, not startled, just aware. The taller one behind it also turned, both sets of eyes fixed directly on me. They weren't afraid of me. That's what hit me hardest in that moment. These massive creatures, whatever they were, viewed my truck, a 2-ton metal machine, with complete indifference, like I was the one who should be afraid. They were right. The growl intensified. The closest one took a step toward my truck. My window was still open. I didn't think. I stomped the gas pedal, the Sierra's engine roaring to life. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before finding grip on the wet asphalt. I shot forward, the truck fishtailing slightly before straightening out. In my side mirror, I caught a final glimpse of them standing motionless in the road, watching me flee. Their eyes reflected my taillights, 2 pairs of red dots glowing in the darkness. I didn't slow down until I was 5 miles away, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You saw what now?" My mother looked up from her morning coffee, eyebrows raised. I hadn't slept. As soon as I'd gotten home, I'd locked every door and window, then sat in my living room with the lights on until dawn broke. Only then did I feel safe enough to drive to my mom's place, needing to tell someone what I'd seen. "I don't know exactly," I said, running my hands through my hair. "They were huge, Mom, covered in this long brown hair." "They?" She set her mug down. "There were 2 of them. On Route 122, down in that marshy section near the woods." Mum's expression changed, not dismissive anymore, not humoring me. "What time was this?" "Just before midnight, maybe 11:50 or so." She nodded slowly, then got up and went to the bookshelf in her living room. She returned with an old, worn book. The cover showed a large, hairy, humanoid figure walking through forest. "Sasquatches," she said simply, placing the book on the table between us. "Sounds like you saw Sasquatches, Jake." I stared at the illustration on the cover. The resemblance was striking. "That's crazy, Mom. Bigfoot isn't real." But even as I said it, I knew what I'd seen was real. It wasn't a person in a costume. It wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. It was something else entirely. "People around here have been seeing them for generations," she said. "My father, your grandfather, saw one back in 73, up near Crystal Lake. Nobody believed him either." I flipped through the book. Page after page of reported sightings, sketches, blurry photographs. Some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen with uncanny precision. "They let you see them," Mum said quietly. "What do you mean?" "They're not stupid, Jake. They know how to stay hidden. If you saw them, it's because they allowed it." A chill ran down my spine. I remembered how calmly they had observed me, how deliberately they moved. Not like animals caught in headlights, more like sentinels guarding their territory. "The growl," I said. "One of them growled at me. It didn't sound like anything I've ever heard." Mom nodded. "That was a warning. You were lucky." "Lucky? I nearly had a heart attack." "Lucky they only warned you." She took back the book and opened it to a marked page. Some encounters don't end with the person driving away. I didn't want to read whatever was on that page. The memory of those red eyes watching me was enough. I couldn't stay away. That's the thing about fear mixed with fascination. It pulls you back to the source, even when every rational part of your brain screams at you to run the other direction. 3 nights later, I found myself driving down Route 122 again. This time with purpose. This time with a spotlight mounted to my truck and my phone ready to record video. This time in clear weather, no fog to obscure my vision. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m. I'd timed it to match my previous encounter as closely as possible. The road was empty, just me and the darkness. I slowed as I approached the marshy section, my high beams cutting through the night. Nothing. Just trees and underbrush, and the occasional reflective eyes of a raccoon or possum scurrying away from my lights. I reached the exact spot where I'd seen them. I was sure of it. There was that distinctive dead pine with the split trunk just off the shoulder. I pulled over, letting my truck idle as I swept the spotlight across the tree line. The woods were silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the low rumble of my engine and the occasional creak of branches in the light wind. I cut the engine. The silence that followed pressed against my ears like a physical weight. I lowered my window and listened. Nothing for 5 minutes, 10, 15. I was about to give up when I heard it. Not a growl this time. A knock. 3 distinct knocks, like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree trunk. Solid, deliberate sounds that carried through the still night air. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence again. My heart rate doubled. The knocks had come from deep in the woods, maybe 100 yards in. I aimed my spotlight in that direction, but saw nothing but trees. Then movement caught my eye. Not where the knocks had come from, but closer. Much closer. Just at the edge of the woods, perhaps 30 feet from my truck. A branch moved, not swaying in the wind, but pulled aside deliberately, like someone parting a curtain to peer through. I grabbed my phone and started recording, pointing it toward the movement. Through the screen, I saw nothing but dark shapes against darker backgrounds. The phone's camera wasn't designed for night recording. The branch moved again. Something large shifted in the shadows. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. What was I expecting? A friendly response. The woods fell still again. Whatever had moved the branch was either gone or perfectly motionless now. I waited another 20 minutes, recording the whole time despite knowing I'd probably captured nothing but blackness. Finally, I started the engine and drove home, checking my mirrors every few seconds. The footage was useless, as expected. Just grainy darkness with occasional lens flare from my spotlight. I deleted it, but I couldn't delete what was happening to me. The encounter had changed something inside me. I found myself researching Sasquatch sightings obsessively, reading every book and article I could find. Mum's book was just the start. I ordered more online, joined forums, contacted self-described Bigfoot hunters in the region. Most were clearly delusional or attention seekers, but a few seemed sincere, level-headed, people who, like me, had seen something they couldn't explain and couldn't forget. A man named Harlan from over in Linden had a similar experience in 2019. He described the same growl, like a rolling snare drum increasing in intensity. He'd been hunting at the time and had dropped his rifle and run, never went back for it. "Weren't worth my life," he told me over the phone, "and that's what it would have cost me if I'd stayed." "You think they would have attacked you?" I asked. "Son, I know they would have. They were protecting something. Territory, maybe, or young'uns, don't matter. I was where I wasn't supposed to be, and they let me know it." I thought about the marshy section of Route 122. It was just a road to me, a way to get from point A to point B. But to them, it might be a boundary, a line humans weren't meant to cross, yet we'd built a road right through it. A month passed. I drove that route many more times, always at night, always watching. Nothing, no red eyes, no growls, no knocks from the woods. Just an ordinary stretch of Vermont back road. I began to doubt myself. Maybe the fog had played tricks on my eyes that night. Maybe exhaustion had made me hallucinate. Maybe I'd seen bears and my frightened mind had transformed them into something more fantastic. Then came the tracks. Early April, the last of the winter snow was melting. I was driving home from a late shift, not looking for Sasquatches this time, just heading home, when my headlights caught something unusual on the roadside. Large, dark patches in the remaining snow. I slowed and pulled over. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the chilly night air. Footprints, massive ones, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes. They crossed the road from one side to the other, heading into the woods on the opposite side. The stride length was enormous, at least 4 feet between prints. I followed the beam of my flashlight, tracing the path of the tracks. They came from the marshy area, crossed the road, and disappeared into the dense forest beyond. Not one set of tracks. 2. One larger than the other. I took out my phone and snapped photos, making sure to place my own boot next to one print for scale. My size 11 work boot looked like a child's footprint beside the massive impression. As I photographed the tracks, I became aware of a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I straightened up slowly and turned around, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. "I know you're there," I said, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. "I'm not here to hurt you or expose you. I just want to understand." The woods remained silent, but the sensation of being observed intensified. I backed toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it again. The knock. 3 times. Like before. Knock, knock, knock. Only this time, it came from behind me, the opposite side of the road from where I'd been looking. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, so brief I almost thought I imagined it, I caught movement. A large, dark shape retreating deeper into the trees. Then, nothing. I climbed into my truck with shaking hands and locked the doors. The photos of the tracks were still on my phone. Proof, real, tangible proof that I wasn't crazy. I showed the photos to Mom the next morning. She studied them silently, then handed the phone back to me. "What are you going to do with these?" she asked. I hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know, post them online maybe. Show them to those researchers I've been talking to." She shook her head. "They've lived alongside us for centuries, Jake. Hidden. Watching. What do you think happens if you prove they exist? If people start coming here to hunt them or capture them?" She had a point. The quiet existence of Sheffield would change forever. The creatures, whatever they were, would be hounded, possibly destroyed. "Delete them," she said firmly. "But Mom, this is proof. This could change everything we know about—" "Delete them," she repeated. "Some things aren't meant to be proven. Some mysteries should stay mysteries." I stared at my phone, at the undeniable evidence captured in the photos. After a long moment, I selected all the images and hit delete. "You did the right thing," Mom said, squeezing my shoulder. Maybe she was right. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just erased something important, something that connected me to an ancient world, hidden just beyond the edges of our modern one. I still drive Route 122 at night sometimes, still slow down at that marshy stretch, still watch the tree line for movement or red eyes reflecting in my headlights. They haven't shown themselves again. But sometimes I hear the knocks, 3 distinct sounds carrying through the darkness, always from a different direction than I'm looking. I don't stop anymore. I don't get out with my phone or flashlight. I just acknowledge them with a nod as I drive past, respecting the boundary between their world and mine. Whatever I saw that foggy February night, Sasquatches, Bigfoot, something else entirely, they live here too. They were here long before Route 122 cut through their territory, and they'll be here long after. Some nights, When I pass that spot, I swear I can feel them watching. Not with hostility, but with the same curious caution I felt toward them. Two species sharing the same space, separated by a thin veil neither fully understands how to cross. And maybe that's for the best. Story 3. The snow crunched under my boots as I poked at the campfire with a stick. The boys had turned in about an hour ago, 9 kids packed like sardines in the lean-to shelter 20 yards behind me. I checked my watch. 10:42 p.m. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees, making the January night still and crystal clear. I pulled my park ranger-style hat lower and adjusted my scarf. Boston PD hadn't prepared me for this kind of cold. City cold is different. It's got brick walls to block the wind, steam from subway grates, the warmth of bodies packed on sidewalks. This mountain cold was alive, hunting for any exposed skin. I'd joined Tommy's scout troop 6 months ago as assistant troop leader after 16 years on the force. My shift rotations had stolen too much time with my boy, and at 42 I figured it was about damn time I showed up. Nancy had been asking for years. Tommy was 14 now, not much childhood left to salvage. The trip to the Berkshires was my first overnight with the troop. Some of the kids called me Officer Sullivan instead of Mr. Sullivan, but I didn't mind. Tommy pretended to be embarrassed, but I caught him bragging to Derek Whitman about how his dad once chased down a purse snatcher on foot through Quincy Market. I turned the page of my Louis L'Amour paperback, the fire popping as a shower of sparks rose into the black sky. The book was just an excuse to stay up alone. Truth is, I needed these quiet moments away from the city's constant noise. Movement caught my eye as Derek emerged from the shelter, his lanky frame silhouetted against the snow. He nodded at me before walking toward the designated latrine area, about 50 yards into the trees. Scoutmaster Bill Henricks had marked it with orange tape earlier. Far enough for privacy, but close enough to be safe. I went back to my book. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then came the sound of frantic running, followed by Derek bursting into the firelight, his face pale. He stumbled to a stop, breathing hard. Dark stains spread across the front of his jeans. "Derek, what happened?" I set my book down and stood up. "There's something out there," he gasped, pointing back toward the latrine area. "Something big. I heard it moving around." I grabbed my heavy police issue maglite from my pack, probably just a deer, maybe a black bear, though they should be hibernating. Derek shook his head violently. It wasn't a deer. It was big, really big, and it was watching me. "Did you actually see anything?" "No, sir, just heard it. Like footsteps, but heavy, and breathing." His voice cracked. "I'm not making this up. I believe you heard something." I clicked on my flashlight. "Why don't you go change and get in your sleeping bag? I'll check it out." Derek hesitated. "You shouldn't go alone." "I'm a cop, remember? I'll be fine." I patted the boy's shoulder. "Go on now. Don't wake the others." After Derek disappeared into the shelter, I zipped my parka up to my chin and headed toward the latrine area. The beam of my maglite cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail of footprints Derek had left. Both coming and going, his return tracks overlapping the first set in his panic. The night was silent, except for the sound of my breathing and the crunch of snow under my boots. I swept the light across the trees, seeing nothing unusual. At the latrine area, I found Derek's tracks leading behind a large pine, where he'd obviously gone to relieve himself. The snow was disturbed where he'd stood, and I could see the clear trail of his panicked retreat. I was about to head back when my light caught something else, another set of tracks, much larger, coming from the north and stopping about 10 feet from where Derek had been. I moved closer, crouching to examine them. My pulse quickened. These weren't bear tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They were footprints, human-shaped but massive. Each print was nearly twice the size of my boot, which was a size 10. I placed my hand next to one for comparison. The print dwarfed my spread fingers, almost double the width. I followed the tracks with my light. They continued away from Derek's position, heading east. What struck me most was the stride length, a good 4 to 5 feet between each step. I'd need to jump to match that distance. Common sense told me to go back to camp, but 16 years as a cop had trained me to investigate. I followed the tracks, keeping my breathing steady despite my racing heart. The prints led deeper into the woods, away from our campsite. After about 1/8 of a mile, I stopped to get my bearings. That's when I noticed the tracks had changed direction, now heading toward a dense stand of hemlocks about 30 yards ahead. I swept my light across the area. Nothing moved. I took a few steps forward. Something shifted in the trees. Not wind, there wasn't any. This was deliberate movement. I aimed my flashlight directly at the spot and froze. The beam illuminated a massive brown furred leg. My first thought, absurdly, was bear. But bears don't stand upright for long periods, and bears don't have legs that look almost human in structure. I tilted the flashlight upward, following the leg to a broad torso covered in long, stringy brown fur. My light continued up, past powerful shoulders, to a face that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It was vaguely human in shape, but with a pronounced brow ridge, sheltering deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight with a dull amber glow. Its nose was flat and wide, and when my light hit its face fully, its upper lip curled back to reveal yellowish teeth. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall. Its proportions were human-like but exaggerated. Longer arms, broader shoulders, a barrel chest. The fur covering its body wasn't uniform, but patchy in places, thinner on its face and hands. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, we stared at each other. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air between us. I ran. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was standing there, the next I was sprinting back along the path I'd made, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. Behind me came the sound of pursuit, not the 4-legged gallop of a bear, but bipedal footfalls, heavy impacts in the snow that sounded like miniature explosions in the quiet night. I've chased suspects through alleys, over fences, across rooftops. I'm not slow, but each time the creature's foot struck the ground behind me, the interval between us shortened. Its stride ate up the distance effortlessly. My lungs burned in the cold air. The camp was just ahead. I could see the orange glow of the fire through the trees. 50 yards, 40. The footfalls behind me grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, they stopped. I didn't. I ran until I reached the firelight, then turned, gasping for breath, my flashlight aimed back into the darkness. Nothing. No movement. No sound except my own ragged breathing. I stood there for nearly 5 minutes, scanning the tree line. The creature had stopped pursuing me, though I had no doubt it could have caught me if it wanted to. The shelter door creaked open, and Derek poked his head out. He'd changed into dry clothes. "Did you find anything?" he asked. I made a decision in that moment. Just a black bear like I thought. Nothing to worry about. Probably more scared of us than we are of it. The lie came easily. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen a creature straight out of tabloid headlines? That Bigfoot was real and had just chased me through the Berkshire Mountains? "You sure?" Derek stepped out, zipping his jacket. It sounded bigger than a bear. "Bears sound bigger at night," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Everything does, but it's gone now. Head back to bed." After Derek returned to the shelter, I added more wood to the fire and sat with my back to it, facing the forest. I kept my flashlight in one hand and, for the first time on a scout trip, wished I'd brought my service revolver. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. I watched the tree line until dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold. Nothing approached our camp. At breakfast, Scoutmaster Hendricks asked why I looked so tired. I blamed it on the hard ground and the cold. When one of the boys mentioned Derek's nighttime scare, I repeated my bear story. Derek seemed relieved by the explanation, and the subject moved on to that day's hike to Eagle Rock. I went through the motions that day, helping with meals, teaching knots, participating in the hike. My eyes constantly scanned the woods. Every snapping twig made me flinch. The other adult leaders noticed my jumpiness, but attributed it to city-dweller nerves in the wilderness. Tommy stuck close to me during the hike. "You okay, Dad?" he asked when we fell behind the group. "Fine," I said. "Just tired." "You're acting weird, like that time you came home after the warehouse shooting." "Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. After a shootout in Dorchester 3 years back, I'd been jumpy for weeks. Tommy had noticed, even though I'd tried to hide it. "Just didn't sleep well," I insisted. "I'm fine." That night I volunteered for first watch, then second watch too. Hendricks thought I was being overeager to help, but I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping while that thing might be out there. The second night passed without incident. So did the third. On Sunday afternoon, we packed up and headed back to Boston. As the mountains receded in the rearview mirror of the scout van, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I never told anyone about what I saw. Not Nancy, not my partner on the force, not Tommy, especially not Tommy. What would be the point? They'd either think I was crazy or they'd believe me and be terrified. Either way, nothing good would come of it. But that wasn't the end. 6 months later, in July 1977, the troop returned to the Berkshires for a summer camping trip. Different location, same mountain range. I almost made up an excuse not to go, but Tommy had been looking forward to it. And what were the odds of another encounter? We set up camp near a stream. The summer forest was thick with life, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of fish jumping in the stream. I found myself relaxing as the first day passed without incident. That night I sat by the fire after the boys had gone to sleep in their tents. The summer air was warm, nothing like the bitter cold of January. Scoutmaster Hendricks sat with me for a while before turning in himself. "You seem more at ease this trip, Marcus," he said as he stood to leave. "Do I?" "Winter camping's not for everyone. The cold, the isolation. Some folks never get used to it." I nodded, not bothering to correct his assumption. "Guess I'm a summer person." After Hendricks left, I sat alone, watching the flames die down. The night sounds surrounded me, crickets, frogs from the nearby stream, the soft hooting of an owl. Then those sounds stopped. One by one, the crickets fell silent. The frogs quit their croaking. Even the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze seemed to pause. The forest held its breath. I slowly reached for my flashlight, my heart hammering. The sudden silence was like a warning bell. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. Not close, maybe 50 yards out. Then another, further to the right. Whatever was moving out there was big enough to break branches underfoot. I stood, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The beam penetrated only about 20 yards into the darkness. Beyond that was blackness. A strong, musky odor drifted into camp, like wet dog mixed with something sour. I'd smelled it before, that January night. My mouth went dry. For 10 minutes I stood motionless, listening, watching. Nothing appeared, but I felt it out there. Watching. Maybe the same creature, maybe another of its kind. The feeling of being observed was unmistakable. The same sense that alerts cops to hidden dangers during night patrols. Eventually the forest sounds resumed, first a hesitant cricket, then another, until the normal symphony of night noises returned. The smell faded. Whatever had been watching had moved on. I didn't sleep that night either. The following morning, I made an excuse to check the perimeter of our campsite. I found nothing, no footprints in the summer soil, no broken branches within sight of camp. But I knew what I'd experienced. We completed that trip without incident. and though the troop returned to the Berkshires one more time that year in October, I detected no further signs of the creature. Still, I never fully relaxed during those trips, always volunteering for night watch, always keeping my flashlight close. It's been 9 years now since that first encounter in the snowy mountains. Tommy's in college, studying criminal justice like his old man. I'm still with Boston PD, made detective 3 years back. Nancy and I split up in '82, though not because of the Bigfoot thing. She never knew about that. Just the usual stuff. Long hours, stress of the job, growing apart. I still go camping occasionally, though not in the Berkshires. I've never told anyone about what I saw that night, what chased me through the snow. Who would believe a Boston cop claiming he encountered Bigfoot? I'd be laughed off the force. Sometimes I wonder if Derek remembers that night, if he ever connected his something big with the legends of creatures in those mountains. He'd be about 23 now. Maybe he's convinced himself it was just a bear, like I told him, but I know what I saw. 9 feet tall, covered in brown fur, with eyes that reflected my flashlight and a stride that could run down a man in seconds. I know that it chose to stop chasing me, that it could have caught me if it wanted to. And I know that somewhere in those mountains, it's still out there, watching hikers and campers from the shadows, choosing when to be seen and when to remain hidden. I just hope it stays in the woods, where it belongs. Because I've faced down armed robbers, drug dealers, and killers in my career, but nothing has ever terrified me like that moment when I raised my flashlight and saw what was watching me from the trees. Nothing human should be able to move that fast or stand that tall. Some nights I still wake up hearing those footfalls in the snow behind me, like miniature explosions, getting closer with each massive stride. Story 4. The buck scope caught a flicker of movement between the trees. I steadied my breathing, preparing for the shot I'd been waiting for since 4:30 this morning. Nothing. Just another shadow playing tricks on my eyes. I lowered my Winchester 30-30 and checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. 7 hours in the woods with nothing to show but frozen toes and a cramping bladder. Ohio's early winter had brought temperatures down to the mid-20s, and the wind cut through my layers like they were tissue paper. Shit, I muttered, standing slowly from my crouched position behind a fallen log. My name is James Cooper. 24 years as a Marine sergeant taught me patience, but civilian life tests it differently. 3 years into retirement, and I still haven't figured out what the hell to do with myself. I'd tried everything. Joining the Oakfield Library Book Club, got tired of Susan's romance novel suggestions. Bird watching with the Athens County Nature Society, boring as watching paint dry. And even landscape painting. Looked like my 5-year-old granddaughter's work. Nothing stuck until I rediscovered hunting, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager, following my dad through these same woods. My bladder signaled again, more urgently. I scanned the clearing one last time. No deer in sight. The afternoon sun was already dipping behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I needed to either find a better spot or call it a day. I decided to relocate to a small ridge overlooking a creek bed about 100 yards east. Deer often came to water before dusk. Maybe my luck would change. First, though, I needed to piss. I propped my rifle carefully against an oak tree, unzipped my insulated hunting pants, and stepped a few paces away. The relief was immediate as steam rose from the ground. I watched my breath cloud in front of my face while finishing up. That's when the smell hit me. I've encountered all kinds of stenches in my life, decomposing bodies in desert heat, open sewage in third-world villages, burning rubber and flesh after IED explosions. Nothing compared to this. It was like roadkill skunk soaked in ammonia, mixed with rotten meat and fermented cabbage. The odor was so powerful it made my eyes water and triggered my gag reflex. Jesus Christ, I choked, zipping up quickly and looking around for the source. That's when I noticed my shadow had disappeared from the ground in front of me. Something was blocking the light, something big. I froze, marine training kicking in, assess before acting. The hairs on my neck stood up. I slowly turned my head, looking up and up and up. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. A massive, bipedal creature covered in matted brown fur that hung in thick patches over its enormous frame. Its arms hung at its sides, thicker than my thighs, ending in hands that looked disturbingly human, except for their size, and the black, curved nails extending from each finger. Its chest was barrel-shaped, easily 3 feet across, rising and falling with deep breaths that sent more waves of that horrific stench washing over me. But it was the face that froze my blood. Not quite human, not quite ape. Deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge stared down at me with unmistakable intelligence. Its nose was broad and flat, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. The mouth, a wide slash across its face, was closed, hiding whatever teeth lay behind those lips. A Bigfoot, a fucking Sasquatch, standing 10 feet away from me. My rifle leaned against the tree behind the creature. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. Slow movements. I began to step sideways, intending to circle around to my weapon. The creature's head swiveled, tracking my movement. Its eyes never left mine. I took another step, and my boot caught on an exposed root. I stumbled, tried to catch myself, and fell face first onto the forest floor. Leaves and twigs pressed into my cheek as I landed hard, knocking the wind out of me. The ground vibrated beneath my chest. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching. I rolled onto my back, pushing with my heels to scoot away, but I wasn't fast enough. The creature loomed over me, its massive legs now on either side of my body. I was trapped beneath it, completely at its mercy. This is it, I thought. 24 years in combat zones, surviving firefights and explosions, only to be killed by a mythical creature in the Ohio woods. The Bigfoot leaned forward slightly, its face now in shadow as it blocked the sun completely. I could see steam rising from its fur in the cold air. It made no sound except for its heavy breathing. My hand inched toward the hunting knife on my belt, useless against something this size, but better than nothing. Then I felt it, warm liquid splashing onto my chest and face. The creature was pissing on me. The stream hit my hunting jacket, soaking through to my skin almost instantly. The smell was unbearable, like concentrated ammonia mixed with rotting vegetation. I turned my head away, choking and spitting as some of it splashed across my lips and cheek. The stream continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it finally stopped, I wiped my eyes clear and looked up. The Bigfoot stepped back, its legs no longer caging me. It made a sound, something between a grunt and a snort, before turning away. With shocking speed for something so large, it bounded up the slope toward Dancer Timber Hill, crashing through underbrush until the forest swallowed it up. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the mud and leaf litter now soaked with Sasquatch urine. I lurched toward my rifle, grabbing it and spinning in a wild circle, pointing the barrel in every direction. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the weapon. Nothing. The creature was gone. "Fuck, fuck, fuck," I panted, the smell clinging to me like a second skin. I backed toward the trail that led to the parking area, rifle raised, scanning constantly. Every shadow, every movement made me jerk the gun in that direction. After nearly tripping twice, I turned and ran. I sprinted the half-mile to my truck, slamming into the side of it when I arrived. I threw the rifle into the gun rack and stripped off my jacket and outer pants, right there in the parking lot, stuffing them into a garbage bag I kept in the bed for field dressing deer. The urine had soaked through to my thermals, but I couldn't bring myself to strip down completely in the open. The drive home was a blur. I cranked the heat to full blast, trying to stop my shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from cold or fear. The stench filled the truck cab, despite the windows being cracked open. When I pulled into our driveway in Millfield, my wife Sandra was in the front yard raking leaves. She looked up, smiling until she saw my face. "James, what happened? You're white as a sheet." I climbed out, leaving the engine running. "I'm done hunting." "What? But you love—" She stepped closer, then recoiled. "Jesus, what is that smell? I need a shower, a long one." I pushed past her into the house, stripping down to my skin in the laundry room and stuffing everything directly into the washing machine. I showered for nearly 40 minutes, scrubbing until my skin was raw, but the smell lingered. Sandra knocked on the bathroom door. "James, you okay in there?" "Yeah," I called back, though I wasn't sure that was true. Later, after 3 more showers and half a bottle of bourbon, I sat at our kitchen table while Sandra made coffee. I hadn't told her anything yet. "So," she said, placing a steaming mug in front of me, "want to tell me what happened out there?" I stared into the black coffee. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy? Sandra had been with me through deployments, through the nightmares and the adjustment to civilian life. She deserved the truth, however insane it sounded. "I saw something in the woods." "A what? A bear?" Her eyebrows shot up. "There haven't been bears around here in decades." "Not a bear." I took a deep breath. "A Bigfoot." She blinked at me, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she laughed nervously. "Very funny, James. Did Bill put you up to this? Is this some kind of hunter's prank?" "I'm not joking, Sandra." I looked her straight in the eyes. It was 8 feet tall, covered in brown fur. It pissed on me. The smile faded from her face. "James, maybe you were out in the cold too long. Or maybe you saw a bear standing on its hind legs. The brain can play tricks. I know what I saw." I slammed my palm on the table, making the coffee mugs jump. "I spent 24 years identifying threats at a distance. I can tell the difference between a bear and a goddamn Sasquatch standing over me." Sandra went quiet, studying my face. After 30 years together, she knew when I was bullshitting and when I wasn't. "You really believe you saw this?" she said finally. "I don't just believe it. I experienced it. I can still smell it on me." I ran a hand over my face. "Look, I know how it sounds. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." She reached across the table and took my hand. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing. I'm not going back out there." "But you should report it, shouldn't you? What if someone else encounters it?" I shook my head. "Report what? That I saw a creature most people think is a myth? That it marked me like I was in its territory? They'd give me a breathalyzer test and send me for a psych eval." "But no, Sandra. I'm not saying anything to anyone." I squeezed her hand. "I got lucky. It could have torn me apart, but it didn't. I'm not pushing that luck again." The next morning I called Bill Stevens, who'd gotten me into hunting in the first place. Told him I was selling all my gear. When he asked why, I made up something about arthritis in my knees, making it too hard to track through the woods. He didn't buy it, but didn't press either. 2 weeks passed. The smell eventually faded from my skin, but not from my memory. I kept having dreams, not nightmares exactly, but unsettling visions of those intelligent eyes staring down at me. In the dreams, sometimes the creature spoke, though I could never remember what it said when I woke up. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I noticed something on our back porch, a dead rabbit, its neck cleanly broken. No blood, no signs of it being eaten, just placed there deliberately at our back door. I looked out into the darkness of our property, which backed up against a stretch of woodland. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, something large shifting in the shadows. Then it was gone. I left the rabbit where it was and went back inside, locking the door. "Everything okay?" Sandra asked as I came in. "Yeah," I lied. "Everything's fine." But I knew it wasn't fine. The message was clear. I had been marked. This was its territory. And while it had let me go once, I understood the implicit warning. I had been granted one free pass. I never told Sandra about the rabbit. I disposed of it the next morning and installed motion sensor lights around our property that same day. I also took my old service pistol out of storage and started keeping it in my bedside drawer. Sometimes at night, I wake up to that smell, faint but unmistakable, drifting through our open window. On those nights, I lie awake until dawn, pistol in hand, listening to the sounds of the Ohio forest beyond our yard. I don't hunt anymore, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being hunted, that those eyes are watching me, waiting for me to venture back into its domain. The creature marked me that day in the woods, claimed me in some primal way I don't understand. 24 years as a Marine taught me many things, but nothing prepared me for what I found in those woods, or maybe for what found me. Some territories once marked stay marked forever. Story 5. The sun beat down on my arms as I kicked at the dirt. A dust cloud rose from my worn sneakers, hanging in the air like those magic tricks on TV. June in Pennsylvania meant freedom. School was out for summer, and the days stretched longer than patience. Today promised something different, though. Aunt Millie had actually smiled when she told me to get in the car. "Michael, today we're going somewhere special," she'd said, jingling her car keys. That's how I found myself bouncing in the passenger seat of Aunt Millie's 1972 Oldsmobile Cutlass, watching telephone poles zip by on the highway. The windows were down, and Aunt Millie's cigarette smoke whipped out into the rushing air. She wore her usual outfit, polyester pants with an elastic waist and a button-up blouse with small flowers on it. Her grey-streaked hair was pulled back tight enough that it looked painted on. "How much longer?" I asked for probably the 10th time. Aunt Millie sighed, tapping ashes into the metal ashtray she'd pulled from the dashboard. 20 minutes, Michael. Same as when you asked 5 minutes ago. I was 8 years old that summer of 1976, and patience wasn't my strong suit. Mum and Dad both worked at the glass factory in town, pulling double shifts whenever they could. That meant Aunt Millie watched me most days. She wasn't mean, just stern, like she'd forgotten what being a kid felt like. The car turned off the highway onto a narrower road lined with dense trees. A wooden sign confirmed what Aunt Millie had promised. Allegheny State Forest. "We're here," I shouted, pressing my face against the window glass. "Sit back, Michael. You'll leave smudges." The car crunched over gravel as we pulled into a small parking area. Only 2 other cars were there, a beat-up pickup truck and a station wagon with wood paneling on the sides. I was out of my seat before Aunt Millie had fully stopped the car. "Hold your horses," she said, pulling the key from the ignition. "We need to go over the rules first." I fidgeted as she listed them off. Stay where she could see me. Don't eat anything from the forest. Watch for snakes. Be back when she called. The usual Aunt Millie stuff, just with trees around us instead of suburban houses. "Can I go now?" I bounced on my toes. She nodded, lighting another cigarette. "I'll be right behind you." Freedom hit me like a sugar rush. The forest was nothing like the small patch of woods behind our neighborhood. These trees stretched so high I had to crane my neck to see their tops. The ground felt springy beneath my feet, covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. Smells I'd never experienced before filled my nose. Rich earth, pine sap, something musty and ancient. I ran ahead, stopping to examine a fallen log that had split open. Inside, tiny white grubs wiggled in the rotting wood. Nearby, a red-capped mushroom pushed up through the forest floor. "Don't touch that!" Aunt Millie called from behind me. She walked with her usual measured pace, a thermos of coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other. For the next few hours, I experienced more nature than I'd seen in my entire life. I found a salamander hiding under a rock, its skin slick and orange. I collected oddly shaped pine cones and interesting rocks, stuffing my pockets until they bulged. Aunt Millie followed at a distance, occasionally pointing out a bird or telling me the name of a plant. The real highlight came mid-morning when we spotted a deer and 2 fawns. They stood frozen at the edge of a small clearing, staring at us with huge dark eyes. The mother's ears twitched, alert for danger. The fawns, still spotted, stayed close to her sides. "Don't move," Aunt Millie whispered, her hand on my shoulder. For once, I listened without argument. We watched the deer family for what felt like forever until something snapped in the distance and they bounded away, white tails flashing. "Wow," I breathed. Even Aunt Millie seemed impressed. "That's something you don't see in Westbrook, is it?" By noon, my stomach grumbled loud enough for Aunt Millie to hear. We found a picnic table near the parking area, and she unpacked lunch from her large purse, egg salad sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, potato chips, and 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. I wolfed down my sandwich in record time. "Can I go explore some more?" I asked, already standing. Aunt Millie checked her wristwatch. 30 minutes, then we head back. Stay within shouting distance. I took off running before she could add more rules. This time, I headed in a different direction, following what looked like a game trail into the trees. The path wound uphill, getting steeper as I climbed. Sweat dampened my t-shirt, but I pushed on, determined to see what was at the top. The trail opened onto a rocky outcropping that jutted from the hillside. Below, a valley spread out with a creek cutting through it like a silver ribbon. The water looked so clear I could see rocks on the bottom, even from my high vantage point. "Awesome," I whispered, moving carefully to the edge of the rocks. From up here, I could see for miles. The forest stretched in every direction, broken only by the winding creek. I searched for a way down to the water, following the edge of the outcropping until I spotted what might be a path. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a large boulder beside the creek. It was brown and didn't move, partially hidden by some bushes. But as I stared, trying to figure out if I could reach the water from where I stood, the boulder shifted. My heart jumped. A bear! It had to be a bear. I'd never seen one outside of the Pittsburgh Zoo, but I knew they lived in these forests. The creature was huge, sitting hunched over at the edge of the creek, about 100 yards below my position. Excitement surged through me. Wait until I told the guys at school. I needed to get Aunt Millie. "Aunt Millie!" I yelled, turning back toward the picnic area. "Aunt Millie, come quick! There's a bear!" I heard her before I saw her, branches snapping and leaves rustling as she hurried up the trail. "Michael Thompson!" she called, her voice tight with worry. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" She appeared on the path, her face flushed and hair coming loose from its bun. For the first time I could remember, she'd left her cigarette and coffee behind. "I'm fine," I said, pointing toward the creek. "But look, there's a bear down there by the water." Aunt Millie grabbed my arm, scanning me for injuries. "Don't you scare me like that. I thought you were being attacked by something. But I found a bear," I insisted. "Look!" Her expression shifted from anger to suspicion. "Michael, if this is one of your jokes—" "It's not! I swear! Look down there by the creek!" With a skeptical frown, she joined me at the edge of the outcropping. I pointed toward the creek where the brown shape still sat motionless. "See! By those bushes! It's huge!" Aunt Millie squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the sun. She went very still beside me. "Is that—" she murmured, more to herself than to me. We stood watching for several minutes. The brown shape remained motionless, and I began to wonder if it actually was just a boulder. Maybe the movement I'd seen was a trick of the light or my imagination. Then it moved again. Slowly, deliberately, the creature stood up. Not on 4 legs, but on 2. "Jesus Christ!" Aunt Millie cursed, grabbing my shoulder. I stared in shock. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand up straight like that and stay standing. This thing was upright like a person, but much bigger. From our distance, I couldn't make out details, but its entire body was covered in light brown, almost tan-colored fur. It looked around, as if sensing something, then turned its head in our direction. "What is it?" I whispered, suddenly afraid. Aunt Millie didn't answer. She just kept staring, her fingers digging into my shoulder hard enough to hurt. The creature took a step forward, then another. It moved in a strange way, almost like a person walking, but not quite right. Its arms hung longer than a human's would, and it leaned forward slightly as it walked. But it was definitely walking on two legs, moving with purpose, and it was heading in our direction. "We need to go," Aunt Millie said, her voice barely audible. "Now!" She grabbed my hand and pulled me away from the edge. My legs felt rubbery as we hurried back to the trail. Behind us, I heard something crash through underbrush, a sound too loud for a deer or fox. "Aunt Millie, what? Don't talk, just run." We abandoned the trail and cut straight through the forest toward the parking area. Branches whipped at my face, rocks and roots tried to trip me. Aunt Millie's grip on my hand was iron, yanking me forward whenever I stumbled. The crashing sounds behind us grew louder. "It's following us," I gasped. "Keep running." I'd never seen Aunt Millie move so fast. Her usually composed face was pale with fear, lips pressed into a tight line. We burst out of the trees near the picnic table where we'd eaten lunch. Our half-finished meal still sat there, but Aunt Millie didn't stop to collect anything. "The car," she panted. "Straight to the car." We sprinted across the open ground to the parking area. The station wagon was gone, but the pickup truck remained. Aunt Millie fumbled with her keys as we reached the Oldsmobile, dropping them once before managing to unlock the driver's side door. "Get in!" I scrambled across the seat as she slid behind the wheel. The doors locked with a dull thunk that seemed too flimsy against whatever was out there. Aunt Millie's hands shook as she jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As she threw the car into reverse, I twisted in my seat to look out the back window. The edge of the forest remained still. No giant creature emerged from the trees. "Did we lose it?" I asked. Aunt Millie didn't answer. She backed out of the parking space and shifted into drive, pressing the gas pedal so hard the tires spun in the gravel before catching. We fishtailed onto the narrow access road. "Seatbelt," she said tersely. I clicked the belt across my lap, still looking out the windows for any sign of pursuit. Aunt Millie drove faster than I'd ever seen her drive, taking the curves of the forest road at speeds that made the tires squeal. Only when we reached the highway did she ease off the gas slightly. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. "What was that thing?" I finally asked. "Was it a monster?" Aunt Millie's eyes stayed fixed on the road. She reached with one shaking hand for her purse, pulled out her cigarettes and lit one using the car's dashboard lighter. She took a long drag before answering. "It wasn't a monster," she said, her voice steadier now. "At least, not like in your comic books." "Then what?" She glanced at me, then back at the road. "Some people call it a Sasquatch." "A what?" "Sasquatch. Bigfoot. It's supposed to be some kind of wild man that lives in the forests. Most folks say they don't exist." She took another drag from her cigarette. "Guess those folks are wrong." I felt a mixture of fear and excitement. A real-life monster. Not a made-up one from TV or movies, but something real that had chased us through the woods. "Cool!" I exclaimed. "No, Michael, not cool!" Aunt Millie's voice was sharp. "That thing was following us. Hunting us, maybe." The excitement drained away, replaced by a cold feeling in my stomach. Oh. We drove in silence for several miles. I watched the trees thin out as we got closer to civilization. Regular houses and farms replaced the dense forest. "Michael," Aunt Millie said finally, "we're not going to tell anyone about this. Not even Mom and Dad. Especially not your parents." She flicked her cigarette out the window. "They'd never let me watch you again if they knew I put you in danger like that. But you didn't know the monster would be there. Doesn't matter." Her face softened slightly. "Besides, people don't believe in these things. They think we were making it up or that we're crazy. But we both saw it. That doesn't matter to most folks." She sighed. This has to be our secret, okay? Promise me. I considered this. A secret between just Aunt Millie and me felt important, grown up somehow. I promise, I said solemnly. Aunt Millie nodded, seeming relieved. Good boy. We stopped at a diner on the way home, though neither of us had much appetite. When we finally pulled into our driveway in Westbrook, Aunt Millie turned to me before getting out of the car. Remember your promise, she said. Not a word to anyone. I nodded, making a locking motion across my lips. She almost smiled. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature standing up by the creek, turning toward us with that strange, not quite human gait. I heard phantom crashes in the underbrush outside my window, though we lived in the middle of a suburban neighborhood with nothing wilder than Mrs. Peterson's cat roaming around. For weeks afterward, I kept my promise to Aunt Millie. It was hard, the biggest thing that had ever happened to me, and I couldn't tell a soul. Not my friends at summer camp, not my parents, not even my teacher when school started again and we had to write about what we did over vacation. Then, almost a year later, I was watching TV one Saturday morning when a commercial came on for a show called In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy. The deep-voiced announcer mentioned something about the legendary Bigfoot, while showing blurry pictures of a furry, man-like creature. I sat up straight, my bowl of cereal forgotten in my lap. That was it. That was what we'd seen. When the show aired the following week, I made sure to be in front of the TV. Leonard Nimoy's serious voice described sightings across North America, focusing mostly on the Pacific Northwest, but mentioning reports from Pennsylvania and other eastern states as well. They showed a short film clip of a large, furry creature walking through a forest, moving exactly like the thing I'd seen, that same forward-leaning gait with long arms. The narrator called it the Patterson-Gimlin film and said it was the best evidence for Bigfoot's existence. I knew then that Aunt Millie and I had seen something real, something that other people had seen too, something that had a name and a history. We hadn't imagined it or exaggerated a bear sighting. We'd encountered a Sasquatch in the Pennsylvania woods, and it had chased us. Aunt Millie never took me back to that forest. Our outings returned to neighborhood walks, where she smoked her cigarettes and sipped her coffee, while I kicked rocks and collected interesting bugs. She never mentioned what happened, and true to my word, neither did I. But sometimes, when a twig snapped in the small wooded area behind our house, I'd catch Aunt Millie freezing, her head turning toward the sound, her usually impassive face betraying a flash of the same fear I'd seen that day. In those moments, I knew she was remembering too. The creature by the creek, standing upright, turning toward us with purpose. The thing in the forest that followed us home in our memories. Story 6. I never should have brought them here. That thought has haunted me for months now. Thomas had been right all along, but I was too stubborn to listen. The cabin in the Alaskan wilderness had been my sanctuary as a child, and I wanted my own kids to experience that same magic. Instead, I exposed them to a terror that still invades their dreams. It'll be fine, Thomas, I had insisted as we packed the SUV that Friday morning. The kids will love it. No phones, no internet, just nature and family time. Thomas had frowned at me while loading the cooler into the trunk. Melissa, that cabin hasn't been used in, 15 years? And it's a 4-hour drive into the middle of nowhere. My dad checked on it last summer. It's rustic but perfectly fine. The kids need this. They're city kids who think adventure is a new video game. I watched as my husband's shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine. But 3 days, that's it. I have meetings on Tuesday. I'd smiled and kissed his cheek, a victory I now regret more than anything. The drive up was actually pleasant. Our oldest, Jacob, kept his nose in a book most of the way, but Ella, our middle child, and Danny, our youngest, pressed their faces against the windows as the landscape transformed from Anchorage's outskirts to dense, primeval forest. The road narrowed, then turned to gravel, and finally to little more than a dirt path as we approached my family's property. "It feels like we're driving off the map," Thomas muttered, as the SUV bounced over a particularly nasty rut. "That's the point," I said. "Complete disconnection." We crested a small hill, and there it was, the cabin. It looked smaller than I remembered, the dark logs weathered grey in spots, the small porch sagging slightly on one side. Time hadn't been kind to my childhood haven. "That's it?" Thomas asked, not bothering to hide his disappointment. "It's cozy," I defended. "It just needs some love." The kids tumbled out of the car, stretching their legs and immediately exploring the small clearing around the cabin. I felt a pang of nostalgia as I approached the front door, fishing the old key from my pocket. The lock stuck, requiring a solid shoulder push to get the door open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of light that filtered through the small windows. One main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen area with an ancient propane stove, and a ladder leading to a loft space where we'd all sleep. It was indeed tiny for 5 people, but I'd been determined to make it work. "It smells funny," Danny said, wrinkling his nose. "Just need some air," I replied, pushing open the windows. "Let's get unpacked and then we can explore before dinner." Thomas silently hauled in our supplies, his tight lips telling me everything about his mood. Still, the kids' excitement as they climbed the ladder to the loft lifted my spirits. This would be good for us. I was sure of it. After getting somewhat settled, I suggested we explore the property. "There's a beautiful pond about a quarter-mile through those trees," I said, pointing east of the cabin. "We used to catch frogs there." "Frogs?" Danny's eyes lit up. "Can we catch some?" "Sure, buddy, let's go check it out." We followed a faint trail through the dense trees. The forest felt alive around us, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind rustling through the pines. Jacob had finally put his book down and was actually smiling. I nudged Thomas, who managed a grudging nod. About halfway to the pond, Ella stopped abruptly. "What's that?" She pointed to the ground where the soft dirt of the path showed several indentations. I knelt down to look closer. Footprints, but not like any I recognized. They were huge, at least 15 inches long, and deeply pressed into the soft earth. "Probably a bear," Thomas said, suddenly alert. "We should head back." "No, look," Jacob said, tracing the outline with his finger without touching it. "Bears don't have feet like this. It looks almost like a person's foot, but giant." A chill ran down my spine. "It's probably just a moose track that got distorted by rain," I said, not believing it myself. The imprint was clearly foot-shaped, with 5 distinct toe marks. "Let's keep going," I said, standing up quickly. "The pond is just ahead." We continued walking, but the carefree mood had shifted. Thomas walked closer to the kids, his eyes scanning the trees around us. The forest suddenly seemed darker, the bird calls less cheerful. We had just reached the pond, smaller and murkier than I remembered, when Danny tugged at my sleeve. "Someone's throwing rocks," he whispered. "What?" "No one's," I started, but then I heard it too. A distinct plop as something hit the water about 20 feet away. "Over there!" Ella pointed to the opposite shore. "I saw something move." Thomas was immediately by our side. "Kids, stay close. We're going back to the cabin." "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident. "Or maybe some locals fishing." "There are no locals out here, Melissa. That's why you wanted to come, remember? To get away from people." Another splash, closer this time. Something had definitely hit the water. "Let's go," Thomas said firmly, already turning back toward the trail. We hurried back, the kids clustering between us. No one mentioned the footprints as we passed them again. but I noticed Thomas studying them with a frown. Back at the cabin, the sun was already beginning to set behind the trees, the Alaskan summer day still long, but the light taking on that golden quality that precedes evening. "I'll start dinner," I said, trying to restore normalcy. "How about hot dogs and beans? Classic camping food." The kids seemed to recover quickly, helping set up our sleeping bags in the loft, while Thomas built a fire in the old stone fireplace. By the time we sat down to eat, the strange footprints and thrown rocks seemed like an adventure rather than a warning. We played cards by lantern light and told ghost stories. Nothing too scary, just enough to elicit giggles from the kids. When we finally climbed up to the loft, all 5 of us lined up in our sleeping bags like sardines. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying fire below. This was what I had wanted. Family togetherness, away from distractions. I fell asleep to the sound of my children's steady breathing and the occasional crackle from the fireplace embers. The next morning dawned clear and cool. I woke first, carefully climbing down the ladder to start coffee on the propane stove. One by one, the family joined me, tousled and yawning. Thomas seemed in better spirits, ruffling Danny's hair as he passed. "Anyone want to help me make pancakes?" I asked. "Me!" Ella volunteered, already rolling up her sleeves. We worked together in the tiny kitchen space, the familiar routine bringing comfort after the previous day's unease. Once breakfast was ready, I suggested we eat outside. "There's a picnic table just behind the cabin. It'll be nicer than cramming around in here." We carried our plates out to the weathered table, the morning sun filtering through the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped this trip would be. Thomas even smiled at me across the table, a silent acknowledgement that maybe this wasn't so bad after all. We were halfway through breakfast when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl from somewhere in the forest. It wasn't a bear. I'd heard bears before. This was different, deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. "What was that?" Jacob asked, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "Just an animal," Thomas said, but his eyes locked with mine. We both knew it wasn't any animal we recognized. Then came the scream. There's no other word for it. A high-pitched, prolonged howl that started human and ended as something else. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the cabin walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The kids froze. Danny's eyes filled with tears. Before any of us could move, we heard a whistling sound through the air. Something large and dark arced toward us. "Get down!" Thomas shouted, diving across the table. The rock, because that's what it was, a rock the size of a cantaloupe, smashed into the center of our picnic table, splintering the wood and catching Thomas in the chest as he tried to shield the kids. He grunted in pain, falling backward. "Thomas!" I screamed, scrambling to his side. He was winded, but conscious, clutching his chest. "Get the kids inside," he gasped. Another rock slammed into the ground just feet away. The children were screaming now, pancakes forgotten as they ran for the cabin door. I helped Thomas to his feet, his face contorted in pain. "My ribs," he coughed. "I think it cracked a rib." More rocks rained down around us as we stumbled toward the cabin. One grazed my shoulder, the impact spinning me halfway around. The pain was immediate and shocking, like being hit with a baseball bat. Once inside, I slammed the door shut. The kids huddled together in the corner, Danny sobbing uncontrollably. "What's happening?" Ella whispered, her face pale. A rock smashed through one of the small windows, showering glass across the floor. We all ducked, and I pulled the kids further from the windows. "We need to leave," Thomas said, his breathing labored. "Right now." "But whatever's out there," I started, "is trying to kill us," he finished. "We make a run for the car. I'll drive. You get the kids in. We leave everything else." I nodded, gathering the children close. "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to run to the car. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back. Just get in as fast as you can." "What if it gets us?" Danny sobbed. "It won't," I promised, a promise I had no right to make. Thomas peered out the unbroken window. "I don't see anything moving." "Car keys?" I pulled them from my pocket and handed them over. "Ready?" He nodded, took a deep breath that made him wince, and threw open the door. "Now!" We ran. The distance to the SUV was maybe 30 yards, but it felt like miles. Rocks continued to rain down, not just from one direction, but from all around us. I heard trees shaking violently to our left, branches snapping and crashing to the ground. Jacob reached the car first, yanking open the back door. I pushed Ella and Danny in after him, then dove into the passenger seat as Thomas started the engine. Rocks pummeled the car, one cracking the windshield directly in front of Thomas. "Go!" I screamed. The tires spun in the dirt before catching. We lurched forward, the SUV bouncing wildly as Thomas accelerated down the uneven dirt road. Rocks continued to hit us, denting the hood and roof. Through the rear window, I saw trees bending and shaking along the edge of the clearing, as if something massive was moving through them. We had just rounded the first bend in the road when Thomas slammed on the brakes. The car skidded sideways, nearly tipping over. Directly in front of us stood, I still struggle to describe it, a creature, massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy black hair. Standing upright on 2 legs, its arms hung abnormally long, nearly to its knees. But it was the face that haunts me. Not quite human, not quite animal. Eyes that held intelligence, rage, and something else. Territoriality. Bigfoot. The word flashed in my mind, though I'd never believed in such things. Thomas threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel as we backed up frantically. The creature let out another of those terrible screams and lunged toward us. "Go! Go! Go!" I shrieked. Thomas spun the car around in a maneuver that defied physics, and we shot back up the road, found another turn, and accelerated away from the cabin, away from that thing, as fast as the SUV could manage on the rough terrain. Through tears, I checked on the kids. They were pressed together in the back seat, white-faced and trembling. Danny had wet himself. Ella stared straight ahead, unblinking. Jacob kept looking back through the rear window. "It's following us," he said hoarsely. "In the trees. I can see it moving." Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, his face a mask of pain and determination. "Don't look back," he ordered. "Just keep your eyes forward." We tore down that dirt road, rocks and branches scraping the sides of the car. No one spoke. The only sounds were the engine straining and Danny's quiet sobs. After what seemed like hours, but was probably 10 minutes, we reached the slightly wider gravel road that would eventually connect to the highway. Thomas finally slowed slightly, his breathing ragged. "Is it still back there?" he asked. I forced myself to turn and look through the rear window. The dirt road stretched behind us, empty, but as I watched, a dark figure emerged from the trees and stood in the middle of the road, at least half a mile back. Even at that distance, I could see its size, its impossibly long arms. "Yes," I whispered, "it's watching us leave." Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror and let out a strangled sound. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Jesus Christ." We drove in silence after that, each lost in our own terror. When we finally reached cell service, we debated calling the police but realized how it would sound. A family claiming to be attacked by Bigfoot. Who would believe us? Thomas's ribs were badly bruised but not broken, according to the urgent care doctor in Anchorage who examined him. We told him we'd had a car accident on a bad road. He gave us a strange look but didn't ask questions. We never returned to the cabin. My father sold the property 6 months later, not asking why I suddenly hated my childhood sanctuary. The kids still have nightmares. Thomas refuses to go camping or hiking. Sometimes at night I wake up to the memory of rocks flying through the air and that inhuman scream echoing through the trees. I know what we saw, I know what chased us, and I know that deep in the Alaskan wilderness there are places humans aren't welcome, places where ancient things still claim territory with violence and fury. When people ask why we don't take vacations to secluded spots anymore, I just smile and say we prefer resorts now. It's easier than explaining that we once made the mistake of trespassing in someone else's domain, someone who'd been there long before us, and who made it violently clear we were not welcome to stay. Story 7. I killed the engine about 3 miles past Clancy's old stilt house, letting the flat bottom drift into a small clearing among the cypress knees. The water lay flat as glass, mirroring the tangled canopy overhead. My girlfriend Jenny had flown to Minneapolis for her cousin's wedding, leaving me with a free weekend and no plans. "Take the boat out," she'd said before leaving. "You never go any more." She was right. Between extra shifts at the lumber mill and helping her fix up the kitchen in our single-wide, I hadn't been on the water in months. So here I was, deep in Honey Island Swamp on a muggy Saturday in August with nothing but time. I propped my feet up on the cooler, popped open a beer, and settled back. The swamp breathed around me, cicadas whirring from the trees, bullfrogs croaking in the shallows, and somewhere in the distance, the splash of a gator sliding into the water. Normal swamp sounds I'd known my whole life. The heat pressed down like a wool blanket. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, something splashed near the boat. I jerked upright, beer can tumbling from my fingers onto the metal floor with a hollow clang. Plunk. Another splash, this time on the other side. I rubbed my eyes, getting my bearings. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the water. How long had I been out? I checked my watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed. Plunk. A rock, definitely a rock, hit the water about 10 feet from the bow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Someone there?" No answer. That's when I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no gators. Nothing. Just the occasional plunk of another rock hitting the water. Growing up in Hammond, Louisiana, I'd spent half my life in these swamps. I knew their rhythms, their sounds. This silence wasn't right. It was like the whole swamp was holding its breath. I scanned the shoreline, peering through the curtains of Spanish moss. The late afternoon shadows made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out the twisted trunks of cypresses rising from the dark water. Another rock splashed, closer this time. "This ain't funny," I shouted, standing up in the boat, making it rock slightly. "Show yourself!" Movement caught my eye, something dark shifting behind a massive cypress about 30 yards away. Just a flicker, but definitely there. A hunter, maybe? Some kids messing around? I reached for the trolling motor, thinking it was time to head back. As I bent down, I heard a low sound, almost like a grunt. I straightened up, eyes locked on that cypress. Something moved again, not behind the tree this time, but beside it, a large, dark shape stepping partially into view. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever stood there was big, well over 6 feet tall, and it wasn't a person. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear. We didn't have many bears in these parts, but it wasn't impossible. But the shape was all wrong, too tall, standing upright. It shifted, moving fully into the open, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The thing was massive, covered in dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps from its body. It stood on 2 legs, shoulders hunched forward, arms hanging down almost to its knees. Its head looked too small for its body, sitting low between those massive shoulders. I couldn't make out a face from this distance, just a darker patch where a face should be. And I didn't want to see it any closer. My hands shook as I fumbled with the trolling motor, nearly dropping the handle into the water. The creature took a step toward the water's edge, its movement strangely fluid despite its size. The motor hummed to life, painfully loud in the unnatural silence. I cranked it to full speed, which wasn't saying much for a trolling motor. The boat began to move, agonizingly slow. The creature's head snapped toward me, tracking the sound. Then it let out a noise that turned my skin to gooseflesh, a deep, guttural growl that rose into something between a roar and a scream. It stepped into the water. Shit, 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 I hissed, desperately pulling on the cord of the backup motor. The old Johnson outboard sputtered once, twice, then died. I yanked again, fear making my movements clumsy. The creature was in water up to its knees now, still coming. It moved with purpose, each step sending waves rippling across the previously still surface. "Start, you piece of shit!" I screamed at the motor, giving the cord one more desperate pull. The outboard roared to life, belching a cloud of blue smoke. I twisted the throttle hard, and the boat lurched forward, nearly throwing me overboard. I grabbed the side to steady myself, then steered toward the main channel, away from the creature. I risked a glance back. The thing was chest deep in the water now, still coming. It moved faster than seemed possible, powerful arms cutting through the water as it pursued me. The boat hit a submerged log, jolting violently. The impact sent my tackle box crashing to the floor, hooks and lures scattering everywhere. I ignored them, keeping my eyes fixed on the deeper water ahead. Another look back. The creature was still coming, but the water was getting deeper, slowing it down. Its growls carried across the water, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I pushed the throttle to its limit, the old motor whining in protest. The boat skimmed forward, putting more distance between us. The creature stopped where the water became too deep, standing there with the murky swamp up to its shoulders. Relief flooded through me as I navigated around a bend, temporarily losing sight of my pursuer. I was going to make it. Just needed to reach the more populated areas near the stilt houses, where Clayton and the Thibodeau family lived year-round. The familiar shape of Clancy's stilt house appeared in the distance. Almost there. I eased back on the throttle slightly, not wanting to swamp the engine. That's when I heard a whistling sound overhead. Something massive flew past me, missing my head by inches and landing with a tremendous splash beside the boat. A tree limb, at least 6 feet long and thick as my thigh. It had thrown a goddamn tree limb at me. I didn't look back this time, just opened the throttle full again, pushing the old boat faster than it had gone in years. Water sprayed over the sides as I cut through the channel towards safety. 10 minutes later, I reached the public boat launch, hands shaking so badly I could barely cut the engine. There were a couple of trucks in the parking lot, weekend fishermen loading up to head home. I'd never been so happy to see other people in my life. I got my boat on the trailer in record time, not bothering to secure it properly. Water dripped from my clothes as I climbed into my pickup, hands still trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. As I pulled away from the launch, I caught sight of the swamp in my rearview mirror, peaceful and ordinary looking in the fading light. But I knew what was in there now. Growing up in these parts, I'd heard all the stories about the Honey Island swamp monster. Old-timers at the bait shop talked about it over coffee, describing a 7-foot beast covered in hair that left strange 4-toed footprints in the mud. I'd always laughed it off as bullshit, just another tale to scare tourists and children. I wasn't laughing anymore. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not even Jenny when she got back from Minneapolis. What would I say? That I saw Bigfoot's Louisiana cousin, that I was chased by a monster straight out of campfire stories. She'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I'd been drinking too much out on the water. For 3 days I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing wading through the water toward me. I heard that inhuman growl. I jumped at every sound, flinched at every shadow. On Wednesday, I broke down and drove to Old Man Hibbert's place on the edge of town. If anyone would believe me, it would be him. Hibbert had been talking about the swamp monster for as long as I could remember. Most folks thought he was just a crazy old coot, but I needed to talk to someone who wouldn't laugh in my face. Hibbert lived in a weathered shotgun house with a sagging porch and more cats than I could count. I found him in a rocking chair, whittling a piece of cypress into what looked like a duck. "Well, if it ain't Bobby Tanner," he said without looking up. "What brings you to my doorstep, boy?" I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling foolish. I was out in the swamp a few days back, past Clancy's place. Hebbert's knife paused mid-stroke. That's so. I saw something out there, Mr. Hebbert. Something I can't explain. He set his whittling aside and looked at me properly for the first time, his eyes sharp despite his 80-something years. Sit down, son. I sat in the empty rocker beside him, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. Tell me what you saw, he said. Don't leave nothing out. So I told him everything. The rocks, the silence, the creature wading through the water, the thrown tree limb. As I spoke, Heber's expression grew more serious, the deep wrinkles in his face seeming to deepen further. When I finished, he reached for a mason jar of amber liquid beside his chair and took a long sip before offering it to me. The moonshine burned all the way down, but I welcomed the sensation. You ain't the first to see it, he said finally, but most folks who do don't come talking about it. They either convince themselves they imagined it, or they keep quiet for fear of being called crazy. What is it? I asked. Some kind of undiscovered animal. Hebert snorted. Undiscovered? People been seeing that thing since before my grandpappy's time. The Choctaw had stories about it. Called it the Latish. A child abandoned to the swamp, raised by gators, turned into something not quite human anymore. He took the jar back from me for another sip. Course, that's just one story. There's others. Some say it's what's left of some prehistoric ape. Others say it's something that came from somewhere else, somewhere it don't belong. But what do you think it is? I pressed. Hebert fixed me with a steady gaze. I think some things ain't meant to be understood, boy. That swamp's been around a hell of a lot longer than any of us. Got its own rules, its own secrets. He leaned forward in his chair. You planning on going back out there? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. The thought of returning to that isolated stretch of water made my throat close up. No, sir. I don't think I am. Hebert nodded, seemingly satisfied. Smart. Some folks, they see something like what you saw, they get obsessed. Want proof. Want to show the world they ain't crazy. What happens to them? Some of them don't come back, he said simply. Others come back changed. Start seeing things no one else can see. Hearing things no one else can hear. A chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat. One of Heber's cats jumped into my lap, startling me. I stroked it absently, trying to calm my nerves. You think it kills people? I asked, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Hebert was quiet for a long moment. I think anything cornered can be dangerous. Animal man, or whatever's in between. We sat in silence after that, the only sound the creak of our rocking chairs and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Eventually I thanked him and left, not feeling much better than when I'd arrived. That was 3 weeks ago. I told Jenny I'd sold the boat to a guy in Baton Rouge, made up some story about needing the money for a new transmission for my truck. She was surprised, but didn't question it much. I've been having dreams. Vivid ones where I'm back in that clearing, the creature standing on the shore watching me. In the dreams, I can see its face clearly. Dark, deep-set eyes, a flat nose, a mouth too wide for a human. Sometimes it speaks, though I can never remember what it says when I wake up. Last night, Jenny asked why I've been so jumpy lately, why I flinch whenever the branches scrape against our bedroom window, why I keep the curtains closed all the time now. I almost told her everything then, almost, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said I've been working too hard, not sleeping well. She seemed to accept it, but I caught her watching me this morning with concern in her eyes. I know what I saw out there in Honey Island Swamp. No matter what people might think, no matter how crazy it sounds, I know. And I know something else too. It saw me. It knows my scent, my face, the sound of my boat motor. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and Jenny's asleep, I swear I can hear rocks hitting water, plunk, 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 and I wonder if some things don't stay in the swamp where they belong. Story 8. The summer heat beat down on the small backyard as I cut the crusts off 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Through the kitchen window, I could see Tommy and Lily playing with their toy trucks in the grass. The Hendersons had hired me to watch them, while Mrs. Henderson went into town for groceries and to visit her sister. It was a simple enough job. I'd babysat for plenty of families in Dixon County before. "Keep an eye on them, Jenny," Mrs. Henderson had said before leaving. "They like to wander off sometimes." She'd smiled, her hand squeezing my shoulder. "Especially near those woods. Don't let them go in there alone." I nodded, thinking nothing of it. I was 14, responsible enough to handle 2 kids for a few hours. Tommy was 6, a quiet boy who mostly kept to himself. Lily was 4, talkative and curious about everything. The Hendersons had moved here just a few months ago from Kansas City. Their house sat at the edge of town, backing up to a small stretch of woods that separated their property from the cornfields beyond. I turned away from the window to grab the potato chips from the pantry. The Hendersons had a nice place, bigger than my parents' house in town. Being out here with all this space seemed nice, even with the isolation. The closest neighbor was the Millers, about a quarter mile down the road. When I returned to the window, the backyard was empty. "Tommy? Lily?" I called out, pushing open the back door and stepping onto the porch. The July humidity immediately clung to my skin. "Kids, where'd you go?" No answer. My heart rate picked up. Mrs. Henderson's warning echoed in my head as I scanned the property. The toys sat abandoned in the grass. The tree swing swayed gently in the breeze. At the edge of the yard, the woods stood dark and dense. "Tommy! Lily!" I shouted louder, walking across the lawn. "Come back right now!" I stopped at the line where the mowed grass gave way to wild undergrowth. The woods weren't deep, maybe 100 yards across before opening up to the cornfield, but they were thick with trees and brush. I strained to listen for any sound of the children. "Damn it," I muttered, stepping into the woods. Twigs snapped under my sneakers as I pushed through the branches. "Tommy, Lily, answer me." The temperature dropped as I moved deeper into the shade of the trees. Despite the short distance, the house quickly disappeared from view behind me. Sweat trickled down my back as I moved forward, calling their names. "We're here!" Lily's high-pitched voice finally responded from somewhere ahead. I sighed with relief and pushed toward the sound, branches scratching my bare arms. "You two are in big trouble. You know you're not supposed to—" I froze when I spotted them. They stood in a small clearing, looking back toward me. Tommy's face was pale, his eyes wide. Lily waved at me. "Jenny, we found a doggy," she said, pointing deeper into the woods. "It was crying." I grabbed both their hands. "We need to go back to the house, now!" "But the doggy needed help," Lily protested as I pulled them along. Tommy said nothing, just let me drag him back toward the house. His silence bothered me more than Lily's protests. "Tommy, what's wrong?" I asked, still walking briskly. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the ground. When we emerged from the woods back into the yard, I knelt down in front of them. "Don't ever do that again. You scared me half to death." "Sorry," Lily said, but didn't look particularly sorry. "We heard a dog crying and wanted to help." I turned to Tommy. "What about you? What did you see in there?" He shrugged, still avoiding my eyes. "Nothing." "Well, lunch is ready," I said finally. "Let's eat on the porch. It's nice out." We settled at the picnic table on the back porch. The sandwiches sat untouched in front of Tommy while Lily chattered about the poor doggy they'd heard. I kept glancing at Tommy, wondering what had happened in those woods to make him so quiet. "Did you actually see a dog?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "We heard it crying." Tommy pushed his sandwich away. "I'm not hungry." A sudden breeze swept across the yard, carrying with it a sharp, pungent smell that made my nose wrinkle. It was like wet fur mixed with something metallic and rotten. "Ew, what's that smell?" Lily pinched her nose. I stood up, scanning the edge of the woods. The smell grew stronger. That's when I saw it. Movement between the trees. Not a deer or a raccoon. Something big, something walking on 2 feet. "Kids," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the woods. "Go inside. Right now." "But I'm not done," Lily started. "Now!" I hissed. The urgency in my voice got their attention. Tommy grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her toward the door. I heard it slam behind them as they went inside. I remained frozen on the porch, unable to move, as I watched a figure emerge from the tree line. It stood upright on 2 legs, easily 7 feet tall. Dark hair or fur covered its entire body. The proportions were all wrong. Too long in the arms, too broad in the chest, too narrow in the hips to be human. But it walked like a person, deliberate steps crossing the wild growth at the edge of the yard. Under one arm, it carried something. My stomach lurched as I realized it was a dog, limp, bloodied, and clearly dead. A collar still hung around its neck. The miller's German shepherd. The creature stopped at the edge of the mowed lawn, its head turning slowly toward the house, toward me. Though I couldn't make out its face from this distance, I felt its eyes lock onto mine. My legs trembled. My mouth went dry. I wanted to run but couldn't make my body respond. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air between us, not like any animal I'd ever heard. Too deep, too deliberate. The sound broke my paralysis. I screamed and backpedaled into the door, fumbling with the handle and practically falling inside. I slammed it shut and twisted the lock, then ran to check the front door and all the windows. "Jenny, what's wrong?" Lily asked from the living room, where the kids huddled together on the couch. "Nothing," I lied, my voice shaking. Just stay inside, okay?" I peeked through the curtains. The creature still stood at the edge of the yard, motionless, staring at the house. The dead dog dangled from its grip, blood dripping onto the grass. "What did you see in the woods, Tommy?" I asked, not turning away from the window. Silence. "Tommy, please, this is important." "The monster," he whispered finally. "It grabbed Mr. Miller's dog." I turned to face him. "You saw it?" He nodded, eyes welling with tears. "It picked up the dog. The dog was barking, and then it wasn't." "What do you mean?" Tommy's voice dropped even lower. "It squeezed until the dog stopped moving. There was blood." Lily looked between us, confused. "Tommy said we shouldn't tell. He said the monster would come for us if we told." I returned to the window. The creature was gone. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. The smell still hung in the air. We spent the next 3 hours inside. I turned on the TV loud to drown out any sounds from outside and pulled all the curtains closed. The kids sat quietly, Tommy barely speaking, Lily picking up on the tension and staying unusually subdued. When Mrs. Henderson's car finally pulled into the driveway, I nearly cried with relief. I watched from the window as she got out of the car and walked to the house, completely unaware of what lurked in the woods behind her home. "Everything go okay?" she asked brightly as she came through the door, arms full of grocery bags. "Fine," I lied. "The kids were great." "Mommy, we saw a monster in the woods," Lily blurted out. Mrs. Henderson laughed. "Did you now?" "It wasn't a monster," I said quickly. "They were playing pretend, but they did wander into the woods when I wasn't looking. I told them not to do it again." Mrs. Henderson's smile faded slightly. "I told you kids to stay out of those woods." She set down the groceries. "Thanks for watching them, Jenny. Do you need a ride home?" I shook my head. "My dad's coming to get me." As I gathered my things, Tommy approached me. "You saw it too," he whispered. "The Momo." "The what?" "That's what the kids at school call it. The Missouri monster. Momo." I wanted to tell him it wasn't real, that we'd both imagined it. But the image of that tall, hairy figure carrying the dead dog was burned into my brain. "Don't go in the woods again," was all I said. My dad picked me up 20 minutes later. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? 2 weeks later, the Millers put up posters around town about their missing German shepherd. A month after that, the Hendersons put their house up for sale. They moved back to Kansas City before summer's end. That was 30 years ago. I still live in Missouri, but I never returned to Dixon County. I married a man who loves hunting and fishing, but I never join him on his trips into the woods. I make excuses. Too busy, not interested, allergies acting up. The truth is, I can't stand among trees without feeling eyes on me. I can't hear twigs snap without remembering that growl. My husband thinks I'm being ridiculous. "Nothing in those woods but deer and squirrels," he always says. Last weekend he came back early from a hunting trip, 2 counties over. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he packed away his gear. "Thought I saw something out there," he muttered when I asked what happened. "Something big walking on 2 legs." I didn't press him for details. I didn't need to hear them. I already knew. The Momo is still out there in the Missouri woods, and it remembers me just as clearly as I remember it. Story 9. The engine of my lifted F-150 roared as I hit the gas, sending a cloud of sand spraying behind me. The tires bit into the soft earth of the dune, and for a second I thought I might get stuck, but the truck powered through. I crested the top and caught air for a brief moment before landing with a satisfying thud on the other side. "Hell yeah, Billy!" shouted Darrell from the passenger seat, his beer sloshing onto the floor mats. "Do that again!" It was May 1989, and the 4 of us, me, Darrell, Tommy, and Rick, were doing what we always did on Friday nights, tearing up the sand dunes in central Florida with our trucks and Rick's custom swamp buggy. Most folks in Cedar Grove didn't understand why we'd spend every spare dollar on lift kits and oversized tires, but out here, flying across the dunes under a blanket of stars, it made perfect sense. Tommy's red Chevy Silverado followed behind me, its headlights bouncing wildly as he navigated the uneven terrain. Rick's swamp buggy brought up the rear, its massive tires and open frame making it look like some kind of apocalyptic dune vehicle. "We got the whole place to ourselves now," Darrell said, cracking open another beer from the cooler between us. He was right. Earlier there had been maybe 15 other trucks and buggies scattered throughout the area, mostly locals like us, but a few tourists too. But as midnight approached, they'd all cleared out. The last group had left about 20 minutes ago, a couple of guys from Oakville who had work in the morning. "One more run, then we should probably head back," I said, checking the time on my dashboard clock, 11:42 p.m. "Oh, come on, Billy, night's still young," Darrell protested. "Yeah, but remember last time, that park ranger nearly caught us. These dunes are technically closed after 10. Darrell rolled his eyes but didn't argue. I grabbed the CB radio mic. "Tommy, Rick, I'm thinking one more circuit, then we head home. Over." The radio crackled. "Copy that," came Tommy's voice. "Let's hit the North Ridge one more time. Out." I yanked the wheel to the left, and we made our way toward the tallest dune in the area. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the sandy terrain ahead. For 20 more minutes, we tore around the dunes, engines roaring, tires spinning. It felt like freedom. Finally, I brought the truck to a stop at the top of the North Ridge. Tommy pulled up beside me, and Rick parked his buggy a few feet back. "All right, boys," I said over the CB. "Time to call it a night." There were some groans of disappointment, but everyone agreed. We'd been out since sunset, and I could feel the fatigue starting to set in. We headed toward the access road that would take us back to the highway. The sand dunes gradually gave way to dense pine forest on either side of the narrow dirt road. Our headlights barely penetrated the thick vegetation. It was a single-lane path that twisted for about 2 miles before reaching the main road. We were about half a mile in when I slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Darrell exclaimed, bracing himself against the dashboard. My headlights illuminated what looked like a massive pine tree stretched completely across the road. It must have been at least 3 feet thick at its base, with a tangle of branches spreading out in all directions. "Damn it," I muttered, grabbing the CB. "Tommy, Rick, we've got a problem. Trees down across the road." I put the truck in park and stepped out. The night air felt cool against my skin after the stuffiness of the cab. Tommy and Rick joined me, and we stood staring at the obstacle. "That wasn't there when we came in," Rick said, scratching his beard. He was the oldest of our group at 24, and somehow that made him our default problem solver. "Must have just fallen," Tommy suggested. "There was that storm 2 days ago. Probably weakened it." "Well, we ain't getting around it," I said, looking at the dense forest on either side. "Too tight." Darrell, who had finally stumbled out of my truck, took a swig of beer. "So what do we do? Go back? There's no other way out of these dunes." Rick walked up to the tree, examining it. "Maybe we can move it. Between the 4 of us and a tow chain, we might be able to drag it enough to squeeze by." "Worth a shot," I agreed. "I've got chains in my toolbox." As I turned back toward my truck, I heard it. A strange clicking sound, like stones being knocked together, coming from the woods to our right. Click, click, click. Then silence. "You guys hear that?" I asked. Tommy nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "What is that? Some kind of bird?" Click, click, click. This time from the left side of the road. "That ain't no bird," Darrell said, suddenly sounding more sober. "Probably just raccoons or something," Rick suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Tommy took a few steps toward the sound, peering into the darkness beyond our headlights. "I'm gonna check it out." "Tommy, don't!" I started, but he was already walking into the underbrush, his flashlight beam bobbing among the trees. We waited in tense silence. The clicking had stopped. The only sounds were the idling engines of our vehicles and the distant call of a night bird. "Tommy!" Rick called after a minute. "Get back here, man!" No response. "Tommy!" I shouted. The bushes rustled, and Tommy burst back onto the road. Even in the dim light, I could see his face was pale, his eyes wide. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Everyone get in the truck now." What did you see?" Darrell asked. "Now!" Tommy shouted, already sprinting toward his Silverado. We scattered to our vehicles. I had just gotten my door open when it happened. A scream tore through the night, a high, blood-curdling sound that was not quite human. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and setting my teeth on edge. "What the fuck was that?" Darrell gasped as we scrambled into my truck. Before I could answer, something hard hit the roof with a loud bang. Then another and another. "They're throwing rocks!" Rick yelled from his buggy. He was right. Stones were pelting our vehicles from all directions. I couldn't see who or what was throwing them, but they were coming fast and hard, denting metal and cracking one of Tommy's side windows. The CB crackled. "Billy, we need to get out of here!" Tommy's voice was pitched high with panic. "We can't get past the tree," I shouted back. "I'm gonna try to drive over it," Tommy said. "My truck's got the biggest lift." Before I could tell him what a terrible idea that was, Tommy gunned his engine. His Silverado lurched forward, climbing up onto the fallen tree trunk. For a moment, it looked like he might make it. The front tires cleared the main part of the trunk, but then there was a sickening crunch as the undercarriage caught on the tree. The back wheels spun uselessly in the air. "I'm stuck!" Tommy's panicked voice came over the CB. More rocks hit our vehicles. Something large crashed through the underbrush to my left, but I couldn't make out what it was in the darkness. Then the whooping started. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part howl, part scream, with a rhythmic quality that raised the hair on my arms. It was answered by similar calls from different directions. We were surrounded. "There's something out there," Darrell whispered, his face pressed against the passenger window. "Billy, there's something in the road." I looked past Tommy's stuck truck, straining to see through the darkness. At first I saw nothing, then a shape moved into the beam of Tommy's headlights. It stood upright on two legs, but it wasn't human. It was tall, at least 6 or 7 feet, with a massive barrel-shaped torso covered in dark hair or fur. Its arms hung almost to its knees, ending in hands that gripped what looked like a thick branch. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out the outline of a heavy brow and a wide, flat nose. "Oh my God," I breathed. The creature took a step forward, raising the branch like a club. The whooping calls grew louder, more excited. There were more shadows moving among the trees now, smaller than the one in the road, but similar in shape. Tommy's CB voice came through, barely a whisper. "There's more of them behind us too." We were trapped between the stuck truck and whatever these things were. Rick was most exposed in his open buggy, with nothing between him and the creatures but air. "Rick!" I hissed into the CB. "Get in here with us!" I saw him nod and start to climb out of his buggy, but before he could make it to my truck, the creature in the road let out a guttural roar and started forward at a hunched, shambling run. Time seemed to slow down. I saw Rick freeze, halfway between his buggy and my truck. I saw Tommy's white face through his windshield. I saw Darryl reach for the shotgun we kept under the seat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip it. Then, like a miracle, headlights appeared on the road beyond the fallen tree. The creature skidded to a halt, its head swiveling toward the new lights. For a split second I got a clear look at its face. A mix of ape and human features, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in the light. The creature let out a final frustrated scream, then turned and bolted into the woods. The others followed, their dark shapes disappearing into the trees. The rock-throwing stopped, the whooping faded away. "Police!" came a voice from beyond the tree. "Stay where you are!" I almost cried with relief. 2 officer silhouettes approached, flashlights in hand, carefully picking their way around Tommy's stuck truck. "What's going on here?" asked the first officer, a stocky man with a mustache whose nameplate read Brennan. We were attacked," I stammered. "There were these creatures. They threw rocks at us and—" "Creatures?" The second officer, younger and thinner, looked skeptical. "What kind of creatures?" "Bigfoot," Tommy said, climbing out of his truck. "I saw it clear as day, 7 feet tall, covered in hair. There were at least 3 or 4 of them." The officers exchanged a look. "Have you boys been drinking tonight?" Officer Brennan asked, eyeing the beer cans visible in my truck. "Yes, sir, but that's not—" I began. "These dunes are closed after 10 p.m., the younger officer interrupted. "You're all trespassing." "Did you hear what we said?" Rick demanded. "There are monsters in these woods." Officer Brennan sighed. "Look, we've heard all the Bigfoot stories before. This area's famous for them. But in 20 years on the force, I've never seen any evidence." "Then what threw those rocks?" Darryl asked, pointing to the dents in our vehicles. "Probably local kids playing pranks," the younger officer said dismissively. "They like to scare off trespassers." I wanted to argue, to make them understand what we'd seen, but I could tell they'd already made up their minds. And honestly, part of me was just grateful they'd shown up when they did. The officers wrote us tickets for trespassing, $75 each, a sum I would gladly pay 100 times over for their timely arrival. They called a tow truck for Tommy's Silverado and helped clear enough of the fallen tree for the rest of us to squeeze past. As we waited for the tow truck to arrive, Officer Brennan walked over to where I was leaning against my truck. "You really think you saw a Bigfoot?" he asked, his voice lower, more serious than before. "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "We all do." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark woods. "My granddaddy used to tell stories about the skunk apes in these woods. Said they'd throw rocks to warn people away from their territory. If you did see something—" He paused. "Just count yourself lucky you got out." The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later. As we finally drove away from the dunes, I couldn't stop looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those tall, hairy figures emerge from the trees again. We never went back to those dunes. In fact, I sold my truck 2 months later and bought a sensible sedan instead. Tommy, Rick and Daryl did the same. We still get together sometimes, but we never talk about that night, at least not sober, and never when others might overhear. But sometimes, when I'm driving on a dark road and the trees press close on either side, I swear I can hear that clicking sound again. Click, click, click. And I drive a little faster, eyes fixed firmly ahead, refusing to look into the darkness beside the road, because I know what's out there, and I know how lucky we were that night. Story 10. I felt it right away, that crawling sensation up my spine. Looking back, I should have listened to that feeling on day one. Maybe then I wouldn't wake up screaming some nights, drenched in sweat, hearing those clicks and whoops closing in around me. We'd moved to Bailey, Colorado 3 weeks earlier. Mum got a job at the medical center there, and at 15, I didn't have much say in the matter. I'd been hunting since I was 8 back in Missouri, so the dense pine forest backing up to our new property looked like paradise to me. A sanctuary from all the chaos of moving, starting at a new school, and trying to make friends. That first afternoon after unpacking, I grabbed my hunting knife, a small pack with water and jerky, and headed out to scout the terrain. The August air hung heavy with pine scent as I pushed through the underbrush, marking my trail with small breaks in branches. Standard procedure when exploring new territory. About a mile in, I found what looked like a game trail. Deer tracks everywhere, turkey scratches in the soft soil. I knelt down to examine a particularly clear print when that feeling hit me. A sudden heaviness in the air. The birds stopped chirping. The forest went dead silent. I stood up slowly, hand instinctively moving to my knife. Nothing moved in the trees. No sound except my own breathing. Just an overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there. "Get it together, Jesse," I muttered to myself. "New woods, that's all." I chalked it up to being in unfamiliar territory. After marking the spot as a potential location for my tree stand, I headed back, moving quicker than I'd like to admit. That night, I cleaned my rifle and organized my hunting gear, pushing away the memory of that strange feeling. The next morning, I strapped my folded tree stand to my back, slung my 30-06 over my shoulder, and headed out before dawn. The forest felt different in the early light, more welcoming somehow. Dew clung to everything, and birds called out their morning songs. By the time I reached the game trail, that sense of unease from yesterday seemed ridiculous. I found a sturdy oak with good sightlines over the trail. Perfect. I leaned my rifle against a nearby tree and unpacked my stand. The work was familiar and calming, securing the platform, testing the straps, making sure everything was stable. I was about 12 feet up, tightening the final attachment band, when a rock sailed past my head. Not a pebble, a rock the size of my fist. It hit the trunk with a solid thunk, missing me by inches. What the hell? I looked down, expecting to see some local kid playing a prank. That's when I saw it. About 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive pine. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear. Bears made sense in these woods, but bears don't stand that tall against trees. Bears don't have those proportions. This thing was enormous, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and it was watching me, not like an animal watches, like a person watches. I froze, one hand still on the strap, the other gripping the tree. The creature shifted its weight and I got a better look. Massive shoulders, impossibly wide. Arms that hung too long, almost to its knees. No neck to speak of, just broad shoulders tapering directly to what looked like a cone-shaped head. Bigfoot. The word flashed in my mind like a warning sign. I'd seen documentaries, heard stories, always thought they were bullshit. Now one was staring at me from 40 feet away. I glanced at my rifle. It might as well have been in another state. It was propped against a tree about 15 feet from the base of my oak. No way to reach it without climbing down, and no way I was climbing down with that thing watching me. The creature made a sound then, a low chuffing noise, followed by something like a whistle. My skin prickled. It wasn't trying to be quiet. It was signaling. That's when I heard it. Behind me, deeper in the forest. A response. A series of whoops, followed by rapid clicking sounds like stones being knocked together. Then another response, from my right, and another from my left. There were more of them. They had me surrounded. I tried to control my breathing, which now came in short, painful gasps. The original creature took a step forward, moving partially out from behind the tree. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, matted in places. Its face remained shadowed, but I could make out deep-set eyes reflecting the morning light. It took another step forward. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, to make any sound at all. But all that came out was a pathetic whimper, like a wounded animal. That sound triggered something. The whooping from all sides intensified. The clicking grew louder, faster. The creature in front of me moved again, now fully in the open, its massive form no longer concealed by the tree. It tilted its head, studying me with what looked like curiosity or maybe contempt. Then it grunted, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the forest floor, and started walking directly toward me. I was going to die. This creature, this impossible thing that shouldn't exist, was going to pull me from the tree like a child grabbing a toy. I had no illusions about fighting it off. The sheer mass of its arms, the breadth of its chest, it could tear me apart without effort. My body curled inward instinctively, making myself small. I closed my eyes, waiting for rough hands to grab me, to feel the tree stand give way beneath me. The gunshot exploded through the forest like a thunderclap. My eyes snapped open. The creature had stopped, its head turned toward the source of the sound. Another shot rang out, this one firing into the air. "Get away from him!" A man's voice, gruff and commanding, called out from somewhere to my right. The Bigfoot made a sound, almost like a huff of annoyance, then backed away, its eyes still fixed on me. It raised one massive hand, not in threat, but almost like a gesture of acknowledgement, before turning and melting into the tree line with shocking speed for something so large. The clicking and whooping faded rapidly, the sounds receding in all directions. "You can come down now, son." The voice came from directly below me now. I looked down to see an older man, maybe in his 60s, weather-beaten face partially hidden by a grey beard. He held a shotgun casually in both hands, barrel pointed safely at the ground. My limbs felt like lead as I slowly disconnected the safety harness and climbed down. My boots hit the ground and my knees nearly buckled. "First time seeing one?" the man asked, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing deer sightings. I nodded, unable to form words. "Figured as much. You're the Harding boy, right? Moved into the old Peterson place with your mama? How'd you know that?" My voice came out hoarse. "Small town," he shrugged. "Name's Roy Blackwood. Been living on these mountains for 40 years. He glanced in the direction where the creature had disappeared. "They've been here longer. That was... I couldn't even say it. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name you prefer. Family group lives in these parts. Have for generations, far as I can tell." I stared at him. "You know about them. Why doesn't everyone know? Why aren't there, I don't know, researchers or something?" Roy let out a short laugh. "Few of us know. Keep it that way. They mostly keep to themselves, stay deep in the backcountry. You just happen to set up right at the edge of their territory." My eyes darted to my tree stand, still secured to the oak. "I didn't know." "Course you didn't. That's why they were warning you off, not attacking. If they wanted you dead, you would be." He said this matter-of-factly, no emotion in his voice. "They're intelligent. More than most give them credit for. They understand boundaries." I glanced around the forest, suddenly feeling watched again. "There were others. I heard them." Roy nodded. "Family unit. 5, maybe 6 of them in this area. Female with 2 juveniles tends to stay north of here. Big male you saw acts as sentry. How do you know all this?" I was still shaking, but curiosity was starting to replace fear. "Observation. Respect." He shouldered his shotgun. "Come on, I'll walk you back to your property line. Best leave your stand for now. Can come back for it another day, if you're so inclined." I hesitated, looking at my rifle still leaning against the tree. "Grab your gun," Roy said. "But no, it wouldn't have helped you. Not against them. Not unless you're a perfect shot under pressure. And even then, you'd only make the rest of them angry." I retrieved my rifle, checked the safety twice, and fell in step beside Roy as he led the way through the forest. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew every tree and rock. "They've never hurt anyone," Roy continued as we walked. "Not around here anyway. They watch us, study our habits. Sometimes they get curious about newcomers. Sometimes they don't like where we put our structures or trails. And you just coexist with them." I couldn't wrap my head around it. "Something like that. Mutual understanding. I stay out of their core territory. They stay out of my cabin clearing. Occasionally they leave things. Interesting rocks, unusual branches. Could be coincidence, might be communication. I leave things too sometimes." We walked in silence for a while, the forest gradually becoming less dense as we approached more familiar ground. I could see the roof of our house through the trees now. "Why are you telling me all this?" I finally asked. Roy stopped, turning to face me. His eyes, pale blue under bushy grey eyebrows, studied my face. "Because you saw them and lived to tell about it. That makes you part of something bigger now. A secret worth keeping." He gestured around us. "These creatures have survived by staying hidden. The day they become a proven fact is the day their world ends. Hunters, researchers, tourists, they'd never know peace again." I swallowed hard. "I won't tell anyone." "Good." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "Though your mama might wonder why you're so shook up. I'll tell her I saw a bear." The lie came easily, already forming in my mind. Roy smiled slightly. "That works. Bears are plenty scary enough." He pointed through the trees. "Your property starts about 50 yards that way. You can see your back porch from here. I'll leave you to it." I took a few steps, then turned back. "Thank you. For, saving me." Roy was already moving away, his figure blending with the shadows between the pines. "Wasn't saving you?" "Not really. Was saving them from what would happen if they harmed you." He lifted one hand in farewell. "Find another spot for hunting, Jesse Harding. Plenty of game on the west slopes. Stay clear of this southeastern section. It ain't ours." Then he was gone, vanishing into the forest with barely a sound. I made it home, put my rifle away, and told Mom I'd had a bear encounter that spooked me. She fussed over me, made hot chocolate despite the August heat, and called the local ranger station to report a bear sighting. I felt bad about the lie, but what choice did I have? That night, I lay awake, replaying every moment of the encounter. The massive shape, the intelligent eyes, the coordinated sounds from all directions. I'd been surrounded by creatures that weren't supposed to exist. And I'd lived because an old man with a shotgun had some kind of understanding with them. I never went back for my tree stand, never hunted the eastern slopes. 2 months later, Mom got offered a better position at a hospital in Idaho, and we moved again. I didn't protest. Sometimes I wonder if Roy Blackwood was even real, or if he was something else entirely. Some forest guardian playing a human role, but the fear I felt was real. The creature I saw was real. And somewhere in the forests outside Bailey, Colorado, they're still there, watching the tree line, protecting their territory from intruders like me. I still hunt, still spend time in forests across the country, but I'm more careful now about where I step, more attentive to that feeling of being watched. And when I hear strange sounds in the woods, clicks or whoops that don't match any known animal, I turn around and head the other way. Some territories aren't meant for us. Some secrets are better left in the shadows of the pines. Story 11. The rain had finally stopped after 3 days of downpour, leaving the night air heavy with moisture. My breath formed small clouds in the cold as I made my rounds along the perimeter fence of Everett Air Force Base. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting long shadows across the wet asphalt of the patrol road. My name's Hank Devereaux, Security Forces, 2 years into my 4-year enlistment. Most nights on perimeter patrol were mind-numbingly boring. Just me, my flashlight, and 8 hours of walking the fence line checking for breaches. This particular night in October felt different from the start. The digital watch on my wrist read 23:45 as I rounded the northeastern corner of the base, where our property butted up against 3 miles of dense, unexplored forest. The locals called it Blackwood. The trees grew thick right up to within 50 yards of our fence, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that had stood for centuries. I reached the halfway point of the northeastern fence line and paused to radio in my position. "Checkpoint 3, clear, continuing patrol," I said into my radio. "Copy that, Devereaux. All quiet tonight." Staff Sergeant Wilson's voice crackled back. I clicked off the radio and continued walking. The fence stood 12 feet high, topped with razor wire, illuminated every 100 yards by floodlights mounted on tall poles. Between the lights stretched pockets of darkness that my flashlight barely penetrated. That's when I felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. I stopped walking and listened. The usual night sounds surrounded me. Wind, rustling leaves, distant aircraft, the hum of the base generators. But underneath it all, something else. A sound I couldn't place. I swept my flashlight across the tree line. Nothing moved except shadows cast by branches swaying in the light breeze. Then I heard it clearly, a low grunt, followed by what sounded like heavy footfalls on damp earth. Not an animal I recognized. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking protocol. We weren't supposed to engage potential intruders verbally, just report and monitor. The sound came again, a deep rumbling grunt, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing that should exist in these woods. I unholstered my sidearm and flicked off the safety, holding my flashlight in my other hand. Slowly, I directed the beam toward where the sound had originated. At first I saw nothing, then movement. Something massive shifted in the darkness between 2 ancient cedars. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to keep the light steady. 2 points of reflection appeared about 8 feet off the ground, eyes catching the beam of my flashlight. "This is Security Forces. Identify yourself," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast darkness. The eyes blinked. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure took a step forward, still within the tree line, but now partially illuminated. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Standing there, partially obscured by a massive cedar trunk, was what I can only describe as a creature straight out of campfire stories. It stood on 2 legs, covered in thick, dark brown fur that hung in matted clumps from its massive frame. The creature stood at least 9, maybe 10 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as a doorway and arms that hung down past its knees. Its face was the most disturbing part, not fully human, not fully animal. A wide, flat nose sat above a mouth that seemed too small for its broad face. A heavy brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight with an amber glow. The top of its head came to a slight point, giving it a sagittal crest like I'd seen in pictures of gorillas. My training abandoned me. I stood frozen, weapon half raised, as the massive creature regarded me with what seemed like curious indifference. Then it turned its head and made a series of low grunts and rumbling sounds. To my horror, 2 more shapes emerged from the darkness. The second creature was similar to the first, but slightly smaller, perhaps 8 feet tall with a leaner build. It stepped forward cautiously, moving with surprising grace for its size. The fur on this one seemed somewhat lighter in color, though it was hard to tell in the limited light. The third figure made my skin crawl with the implications. It stood only about 5 feet tall, small compared to the others, but still solidly built. It stayed close to the largest creature, one massive hand resting protectively on its shoulder. The smaller one's fur appeared fluffier, less matted. A family. I was looking at a family of creatures that shouldn't exist. My radio crackled, making me jump. Checkpoint 4, Devereaux, status report. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The creatures all turned their attention to the sound of the radio. The largest one took another step forward, now standing at the very edge of the tree line. It tilted its head, studying me with eyes that contained an intelligence I wasn't prepared for. Devereaux, report in. Everything okay out there? Wilson's voice came again. With trembling fingers, I pressed the talk button. All clear, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The three creatures communicated again through a series of soft grunts and low rumbling sounds. The largest one made a gesture with its massive hand, a sweeping motion toward the forest behind them. The second largest nodded, an unmistakably human gesture, and began to back away into the darkness. The largest creature lingered, its eyes locked on mine. It didn't appear threatening. If anything, it seemed to be assessing whether I posed a danger to them. Apparently deciding I didn't, it turned to leave, guiding the smallest one with a gentle push to its back. The smallest creature, the child, I assumed, looked back at me one final time. Its eyes reflected curiosity rather than fear. Then, with shocking swiftness for something so large, all three disappeared into the forest. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, straining to hear their retreat, but they moved with impossible silence through the underbrush. The woods returned to normal, just the sound of wind and distant machinery from the base. My hands shook as I holstered my weapon. Sweat had soaked through my uniform, despite the cold night air. I knew I had to report this, but I also knew how it would sound. At 0200, I completed my shift and returned to headquarters. Staff Sergeant Wilson sat behind the desk, reviewing the night's logs. "Sir," I said, standing at attention, "I need to report an incident." Wilson looked up, his weathered face impassive. "Go ahead, Devereaux." I hesitated, then told him everything. The watching sensation, the sounds, the three creatures, the family standing at the tree line, their behavior, their departure. I described their physical appearance in precise detail, leaving nothing out. I expected ridicule, disbelief, a drug test maybe. Instead, Wilson's face remained unnervingly calm throughout my report. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Location: northeastern perimeter, about halfway between checkpoints 3 and 4, sir." Wilson nodded and pulled out a form from his desk drawer. He began filling it out with practiced efficiency. "Sir," I said, confused by his reaction, "did you hear what I said? I saw a family of Bigfoot," he finished for me, not looking up from his paperwork. "Yes, I heard you, Devereaux." My mouth fell open. "You believe me?" Wilson set down his pen and fixed me with a steady gaze. "You're not the first to see them, and you won't be the last." A chill ran down my spine. "What?" He slid the completed form into a folder marked Wildlife Encounters and locked it in a drawer. "This base has stood in this location since 1942. The local tribes called these woods home for thousands of years before that. Those creatures, whatever they are, have been spotted dozens of times." "But sir, shouldn't we—" "What? Report it to who? The Pentagon's Bigfoot division." He shook his head. "We document it, file it away, and let sleeping dogs lie. There's never been an attack, never any harm done. They stay in their territory, we stay in ours." "But this is scientific evidence of what exactly? You got pictures, video, physical evidence?" Wilson's tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. I slumped. "No, sir." "Then all we have is your report, which I've filed. Same as all the others." He stood up and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Look, Devereaux, consider yourself lucky. Some folks spend their whole lives trying to see what you saw tonight. My advice? Keep it to yourself, unless you want to become the base joke." "Yes, sir," I said, stunned by the revelation that others had seen the same things. "Go get some rest. You're back on perimeter duty tomorrow night. For the next several weeks, I requested the northeastern perimeter patrol whenever possible. I brought a camera, tucked into my jacket pocket against regulations. I walked slower, listened harder, and watched the tree line with obsessive attention. I never saw them again. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I heard distant grunts and rumbles echoing from deep in the blackwood forest. Sometimes I found unusual tracks in the mud just beyond our fence, massive impressions that disappeared into the underbrush. Once, I found tufts of dark brown hair caught on a low-hanging branch outside the perimeter. I sent the hair to a private testing facility using my own money. The results came back inconclusive, unknown primate species, which the lab attributed to contamination of the sample. 4 months after my encounter, I was transferred to another base in the Midwest. Before I left, I had one final conversation with Staff Sergeant Wilson. "You ever see them again?" he asked as he signed my transfer papers. "No, sir, but I heard them, found tracks once." Wilson nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "They're smart, Devereaux. They've survived this long by staying hidden. That night you saw them. You weren't meant to. They made a mistake. Or they wanted to be seen," I suggested. Wilson considered this. "Maybe. Either way, they're still out there." "Have you ever seen them, sir?" He paused, then reached into his desk and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped it open and slid it across to me. Inside was a crude but detailed sketch of exactly what I had seen. The 3 creatures standing at the tree line, the smallest one partially hidden behind the largest. "Winter of '97, he said quietly. "Same spot, same family, I think, though the little one wasn't there yet." I stared at the drawing, feeling validated and unnerved simultaneously. Why doesn't anyone do anything about this? Study them, protect them. Wilson took back his notebook. "Some things in this world are better left alone, Devereaux. The people who need to know. The rest, they wouldn't believe it anyway." That was 5 years ago. I finished my service and now work as a park ranger in Montana. I've never told anyone else about what I saw that night in Washington except my wife, who believes me because she's had her own strange encounters in these mountains. Sometimes I wake up at night with the feeling of being watched. I'll look out our cabin window at the dark tree line and wonder if similar eyes are looking back at me. I wonder about that family. If they're still roaming the forests around Everett Air Force Base, if the smallest one has grown. I keep a camera by the door and a notebook where I record strange sounds and unusual tracks. So far, nothing conclusive, but I know they're out there, hiding, watching, waiting. Not just in Washington, but in wild places across the country, and sometimes, in the deepest part of night when the forest falls completely silent, I catch myself listening for that distinctive rumbling grunt, hoping for one more glimpse of something our world says shouldn't exist. Story 12. I was 17 that summer, full of the confidence of youth, but still green as the timothy grass that covered my Uncle Ray's farm in Bell County. Looking back now, I realize I knew nothing about the world or what walked in it. My parents divorced that year. Mum thought shipping me off to Uncle Ray's farm would give me structure, keep me from falling into trouble back in Lexington. Uncle Ray wasn't much for talking, a knotty, weathered man who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. The arrangement suited us both. I needed the space, and he needed the help. The afternoon it happened started like any other. July heat pressed down, thick as a wool blanket. I'd been mending the fence along the back pasture since lunch. The cattle needed moving to fresh grazing land, but part of the fence had come down in last week's storm. Simple enough job: hammer, nails, replacement boards from the pile in the truck bed. I remember checking my watch, 6:43 p.m. Still plenty of daylight, but the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the field. Sweat plastered my t-shirt to my back. My arms ached from swinging the hammer all afternoon. That's when I first noticed the silence. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just the soft sound of the breeze rustling through the tall grass. I paused, hammer mid-swing. Something felt wrong. The cattle knew it before I did. About 20 head of Angus, normally calm as could be, started shuffling their feet. A few lifted their heads from grazing, nostrils flaring. One of the older cows let out a low, anxious bellow. "Easy!" I called out, more to comfort myself than the animals. That's when the sensation hit me, eyes on my back, watching from somewhere beyond the fence line. Not the casual glance of a passing hiker or hunter. This was the heavy, intentional stare of a predator. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line that marked the edge of Uncle Ray's property. The forest there was old growth, big oaks, hickories and maples that stretched back for miles into government land. Dark and dense, even in daylight. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just trees and undergrowth, shadows deepening as the sun sank lower. Then it moved. Between two massive oaks at the edge of the clearing, something shifted. Something big. At first I thought it might be a bear. We'd had black bears on the property before. Nothing unusual for that part of Kentucky. But as it stepped forward, partially out of the shadow of the trees, I knew instantly this was no bear. It stood upright. Tall, Christ, so tall, at least 8 feet. Covered head to toe in thick, dark brown hair. Not fur like an animal, but hair, long in some places, matted in others. Its shoulders were broader than any man I'd ever seen, tapering to a narrower waist and powerful-looking legs. But it was the face that froze my blood. Not entirely human, but not fully animal either. A heavy brow ridge shadowed its eyes, which caught the fading sunlight, reddish-brown and unmistakably intelligent. A wide, flat nose sat above a mouth that seemed almost too small for its massive head. Those eyes locked onto mine across the 100 yards that separated us, and I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The creature, because what else could I call it, shifted its weight. As it did, I noticed its arms. They hung longer than a human's should, massive limbs ending in hands that could easily wrap around a fence post. Hands big enough to crush a watermelon without effort. Muscles rippled beneath the hair-covered skin as it took one deliberate step forward. That movement broke my paralysis. I dropped the hammer, the clang against the fence post sounding impossibly loud in the silence. The cattle, sensing my fear, or the creature's presence or both, began to move restlessly, a few breaking into a trot away from the forest edge. I backed away, one step then another, keeping my eyes on the thing at the tree line. It didn't charge, didn't make any threatening move, just watched me with those eerily aware eyes. Then it took another step forward, fully emerging from the shadow of the trees. In the dying light, I could see every detail of it now, the way its chest expanded with each breath, the slight hunching of its shoulders, the way the hair on its body moved with the evening breeze. It stood there, massive and impossible, a creature that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. I turned and ran, sprinted across the pasture toward the barn, legs pumping, lungs burning. The cattle scattered at my approach, their own fear feeding mine. I didn't look back, couldn't bear to see if it was following, just ran until my boots hit the packed dirt of the barnyard, then practically threw myself through the side door. Inside the barn's dimness, I collapsed against a stall door, heart hammering against my ribs. Uncle Ray stood by his workbench, looking up from sharpening a blade on the grindstone. "Jason, what's got into you, boy?" He switched off the grindstone, frowning at my state. I gasped for breath. "Back by the south fence. Someone—" "Calm down," he said, setting the blade aside. "Take a breath and tell me straight." I gulped air, trying to organize my thoughts. How do you tell someone you've seen something impossible? "I saw something in the woods," I finally managed, standing upright, huge, covered in hair. It was watching me. I expected disbelief, maybe concern that the heat had gotten to me. Instead, Uncle Ray's weathered face went still. He wiped his hands slowly on a rag, his eyes never leaving mine. "How tall?" he asked quietly. The question threw me. "What?" How tall was it? I don't know. 8 feet, maybe more. It had these eyes, like a person's eyes, and arms that hung down past its knees. Uncle Ray nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. He turned and looked out the small window toward the darkening fields. Did it come after you? No, it just stood there, watching. He exhaled heavily and sat down on a nearby stool. I've seen it too, boy. First time was 15 years back. Figured it would scare you if I mentioned it. My mouth went dry. You've seen it? The same thing? Same thing. Doesn't come around much. Stays mostly to itself in the deeper parts of the forest. Seems to check the boundaries of the farm every few years. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Uncle Ray shook his head. Don't rightly know. Old-timers around here have stories. Some call it a Bigfoot or a wild man. Native folks had other names for it. He looked at me hard. Did it threaten you? Make any sounds or aggressive moves? No, sir, just watch me. Then it's probably best we leave it be. That night, I barely slept. Each creak of the old farmhouse had me sitting upright, straining to hear anything unusual. But morning came uneventfully, and with it, the familiar routine of farm work. Uncle Ray didn't mention our conversation from the night before, and I followed his lead, though my eyes kept drifting to the tree line as I worked. 3 days passed. The encounter began to feel dreamlike, though I knew it wasn't. I'd finished the fence repair, moving on to other chores around the farm. But each evening, as the sun started to lower, I found myself drawn to the south pasture, watching the forest edge from a safe distance. On the 4th night, something pulled me back there after dinner. The evening was cooler than it had been, a rainstorm having passed through that afternoon, leaving everything damp and fresh-smelling. I told Uncle Ray I was going to check on a calf that had seemed off its feed earlier. He nodded, not questioning my excuse, though something in his eyes told me he knew where I was really headed. I walked slowly across the wet pasture, the setting sun painting the clouds in oranges and pinks. The cattle had already been moved to the east field, leaving this section empty. I stopped about 30 yards from the forest edge, not willing to go closer. Standing there, I felt foolish. What was I doing, hoping to catch another glimpse of something that had terrified me days before? Yet I couldn't leave. Some primal curiosity kept me rooted to that spot, as darkness began creeping across the land. The temperature dropped as the sun vanished below the horizon. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. 5 more minutes, I told myself. Then I'd head back. That's when I heard it. A crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the darkness of the forest. My body tensed, every nerve suddenly alert. Another sound followed, the rustling of undergrowth being pushed aside. A shadow moved between the trees, larger and darker than the gathering night around it. I should have run. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, but I remained frozen in place as the massive figure emerged from the forest. It was closer this time, maybe 50 yards away, close enough that I could see details I'd missed before. Its hair wasn't uniformly brown, but varied in shade, darker on its back and shoulders, lighter on its chest and face. Leaves and small twigs were tangled in the matted hair, as if it had pushed through thick brush recently. Its broad chest heaved with each breath, expansive lungs filling and emptying beneath that massive frame. The creature's head turned deliberately, scanning the pasture, until those reddish-brown eyes found me. They locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of recognition pass between us. Not friendly, not hostile, just an acknowledgement of each other's existence. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, human and non-human, regarding each other across the open space. Then the creature did something that stops my breath even now, remembering it. It made a sound, a low, rumbling grunt that carried clearly across the distance between us. Half human, half animal, the vocalization seemed to contain meaning beyond mere animal noise. The sound broke my paralysis. I stepped backward, nearly stumbling over the uneven ground. The creature made no move to follow. Instead, it watched me for another long moment before turning deliberately and moving back into the forest, its massive form disappearing between the trees with surprising grace for something so large. I didn't run this time. I walked backward, keeping my eyes on the spot where it had vanished, until I was far enough away to turn and make my way quickly back to the farmhouse. Uncle Ray was on the porch when I returned, pipe smoke wreathing his head in the yellow light from the kitchen window behind him. "Saw it again?" he asked quietly as I climbed the steps. I nodded, collapsing into the chair beside him. "Made a sound this time," I added after catching my breath, "like a grunt, but different." Uncle Ray puffed his pipe thoughtfully. "They do that sometimes, not often. Most folks around here who've seen one say they're usually silent. You talk about this with other people? I thought—" I trailed off, unsure what I thought. "Not much. Few old-timers who've been in these parts their whole lives. Man who owned this land before me saw one too." He tapped his pipe against the porch railing. "Some things you just keep to yourself, unless you know the other person's seen it too." I nodded, understanding. Who would believe such a story without evidence? Morning came with heavy dew and fog clinging to the fields. Uncle Ray was already up and out by the time I made my way to the kitchen. I found him standing by the barn, staring at the ground, his face unreadable. "What is it?" I asked, coming up beside him. He nodded toward the ground. There, pressed deep into the mud beside the barn wall, was a footprint. Not just any footprint, massive, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide. The impression was clear enough to make out toe marks, 5 of them spread wide, pressed deeply into the soft earth. Beside it was another, and another, leading from the corner of the barn toward the south pasture. "Fresh from last night," Uncle Ray said quietly. "Came up close to the buildings while we slept." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Why would it come so close?" Uncle Ray shrugged, but his eyes held something, knowledge or suspicion he wasn't sharing. "Curiosity, maybe. Same as yours." We exchanged a look, neither of us saying what we were thinking. Something intelligent had walked up to our home in the darkness. Something powerful enough to kill us both without effort, yet it had simply observed and departed. Uncle Ray fetched a shovel and smoothed over the tracks without another word. We didn't speak of it for the rest of my stay, though I noticed he began locking the doors at night, something he'd never done before. I finished out my summer there without another sighting. When August ended, I returned to Lexington for my senior year of high school. Life moved on. College, jobs, relationships, the normal progression that carries a person forward. But I never forgot. 23 years have passed since that summer. Uncle Ray died 5 years ago, leaving the farm to me, his only living relative. I've kept it, though I only visit a few times a year to check on the tenant farmer who works the land now. I've never told anyone else what I saw there. Who would believe me? Yet sometimes, standing on the porch at dusk, looking out over those same fields toward that same forest edge, I feel watched again. The cattle still grow restless sometimes as night falls, clustering together away from the tree line. I dream of those reddish-brown eyes, too knowing, too aware. I wake with the sound of that deep grunt echoing in my ears. And I know, with absolute certainty, that something still walks those woods, something that was there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Something that watches and waits, and occasionally, in the deepening twilight, comes to the edge of its domain to look upon ours. Story 13. The day we moved to the farmhouse on Mount Ridge Road in Spotsville was hot as blazes. July 1975. The kind of Kentucky summer that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've even finished unloading the truck. I remember thinking it was a good omen, sunshine blessing our new start. I was wrong. My name's Red Nonnelly. Worked construction most of my life, but farming was in my blood. When we found this place, 5 acres, fruit trees already producing, good flat land for tobacco, it seemed perfect. Rose was thrilled about the garden space, and our 6 kids couldn't wait to explore the woods and creek that bordered the property. The previous owner, a skinny fellow with nervous eyes, pulled me aside as he handed over the keys. "There's something you ought to know, Mr. Nonnelly," he said, voice low. "Been some trouble with a large, hairy fella around these parts. Might want to keep your young'uns close to the house after dark." I laughed right in his face. "Buddy, I got a 12 gauge that'll handle any hairy fella that comes sniffing around my property." He didn't laugh back, just nodded and left. I dismissed it. Every rural area has its boogeyman stories. The first month passed uneventfully. We planted our late crops, fixed the old fence posts and settled in. The kids adjusted well, Mary and Beth sharing the upstairs bedroom, Dean and little Johnny taking the one next to it, with the twins Susan and Sarah in the small room off the kitchen. Rose seemed happier than she'd been in years, humming while she hung laundry on the line. Then the chickens started disappearing. First just 1 or 2. I figured it was foxes, maybe a coyote. We had 30 chickens, good laying hens, and I built what I thought was a secure coop. But every few mornings Rose would count and find another missing. No signs of forced entry, no feathers, just gone. I reinforced that coop with heavy wire mesh and set traps around the perimeter. Caught nothing. One morning in late August, Dean came running into the kitchen while we were having breakfast. "Dad! Dad! There's something dead in the field!" I followed him out past the tobacco plants. About 50 yards from the house lay one of the neighbor's hounds. But this wasn't any normal dead dog. Its belly was sliced open clean as a butcher's cut, organs removed. The strangest part, no blood, not a drop on the ground or the dog, and no tracks around it. Nothing. "Go back to the house, Dean," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Don't tell your mama about this." I buried that dog deep. 3 days later, we found another one, same condition, then another, all cut the same way, all bloodless. No scavengers would touch them, not even flies. I started carrying my shotgun everywhere. By September, we'd lost over 30 chickens. Rose's prized nanny goat disappeared one night. Then my best hunting dog refused to leave the porch. Our second dog, a German shepherd named Rex, took to hiding under the house, whining. I called Harold, my oldest son from my first marriage. He was 24, had his own trailer. "Son, why don't you park that trailer of yours next to the house for a while? Could use some help with the tobacco harvest." He agreed, though I hadn't told him the real reason. More eyes around the place couldn't hurt. The sounds started in October. First night I heard it, I was closing up the barn, a heavy splashing from the creek, like something massive was wading. Too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun, heading toward the sound. The splashing stopped. The night went dead quiet, no crickets, no frogs, nothing. The beam of my light caught nothing but ripples on the water's surface. That same night, around 3 a.m., we woke to the sound of something circling the house. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crushing the gravel on the driveway, then moving through the grass. The dogs were silent, hiding. "Red, what is that?" Rose whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just a deer," I lied, loading my shotgun in the dark. By the window I saw nothing but blackness. Whatever it was made another circuit around the house, then silence returned. In the morning I found huge, muddy patches where something had walked. Not clear footprints, just compressed earth, too big for any animal I knew. 2 days later, Rose screamed from the backyard. I ran out, shotgun ready. She stood frozen by her clothesline, pointing toward the old storage shed. "There was something there," she said, voice shaking. "Red, it was watching me, tall as the shed roof, hairy all over." I searched the area, found nothing but some broken branches on a tree that stood about 8 feet high, too high for any normal man to reach. We called the state police. 2 officers came out, walked the property, took notes. Found nothing. Might be a bear, one suggested, not sounding convinced. Bears don't take organs without spilling blood, I said. And they don't stand 8 feet tall watching my wife. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Well, Mr. Nonnelly, not much we can do without more to go on. After they left, I installed floodlights around the house, added locks to every window and door. That night, something killed Harold's hound dog right beside his trailer. Same clean cut, same missing organs. No blood. The nightly visits became regular. Something would circle the house, sometimes scratching at the walls. We'd hear heavy breathing outside the children's bedroom windows. The floodlights would click on, but whatever triggered them moved too quickly to be caught in the light. The state police stopped coming after the 4th call, said unless we had concrete evidence, they couldn't keep sending officers. By November, we'd lost over 100 chickens. Rose's horse disappeared from the paddock, leaving behind a section of fence that looked like it had been peeled back like a sardine can. The dog refused to leave the house. Dean saw it next. He was helping me check the fence line near the old truck we used for parts. "Dad," he whispered, grabbing my coat sleeve. I turned to see my 10-year-old son, white as a sheet, pointing toward the rusted Ford. Behind it stood something that turned my blood cold. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, broad across the shoulders. Not a bear. It stood on 2 legs, covered in patchy reddish-grey hair, with a massive square jaw and eyes set too close together. It watched us for 3 heartbeats, then melted into the tree line with surprising speed for something so large. Dean described exactly what I'd seen. A 10-year-old doesn't make up details like patchy hair or square jaw. He'd seen it. The next morning, I found our last goat dead in the field, cut open, cleaned out, not a drop of blood. The Spotsville Gazette ran a small story about strange occurrences at our farm. Called it the Spotsville Monster in the headline. I wasn't happy about the attention, but at least people knew we weren't crazy. Our neighbor Clyde Tarver came over after reading the article. Clyde was a Vietnam veteran, not easily spooked. "Red, I've been tracking something strange on my property too," he said. "Found some hair caught on a fence post. Don't match any animal I know." Clyde showed me a tuft of coarse, reddish-grey hair. Also had a plaster cast of what might have been a footprint, 18 inches long, with 5 toes. Not human, not animal. 2 nights later, Clyde came pounding on our door at midnight, soaking wet and shaking. "I found where it's been staying," he gasped. "Old Simmons' barn, abandoned one down by the river." Clyde described following tracks to the decaying structure. Inside, he'd found piles of bones, mostly small animals, and a bed of leaves and grass in the corner. "It came back while I was looking around," he said, hands trembling as he accepted the coffee Rose handed him. "Big as a doorway. It just stood there watching me. I thought I was dead for sure." "How'd you get away?" I asked. Clyde's face went blank. "That's the strangest part, Red. It spoke to me, not out loud, in my head, clear as day, said, 'Don't be afraid.' Then it just turned and left. I would have called him crazy, except for what happened next. December brought early snow. The thing, whatever it was, became bolder. One night, while checking the tobacco barn, I heard something massive moving between the hanging leaves. When I raised my lantern, 2 reflective eyes stared back from at least 7 feet up. I fired a shot into the air and ran. It chased me. Heavy footfalls right behind me, breathing that sounded like an engine. I made it to the house and slammed the door, throwing the bolt just as something heavy crashed against it. The whole frame shuddered. Rose and the kids were huddled in the living room. "It's back," Beth whispered. "It was looking in my window, Daddy." We spent that night in the center of the house, shotgun across my lap, children sleeping in a pile like puppies on the floor. By Christmas, we'd lost over 200 chickens. Found 8 mutilated dogs, a pig, another goat. No amount of locks or lights deterred it. The thing seemed to be playing with us, testing our defenses. One night, little Johnny woke screaming. "The monster man was in my room," he cried. "He touched my head." The window was locked from the inside, but Johnny's description matched what we'd all seen. Tall, hairy, with those 2 close eyes. The last straw came in January. Mary, our oldest daughter, was bringing in firewood when she stopped dead on the porch. In the yard stood the creature, in broad daylight. It raised one massive clawed hand in what might have been a greeting. Mary dropped the wood and ran inside, screaming. I grabbed my gun and burst out the door, but it was gone. On the porch steps sat a dead rabbit, perfectly skinned, no blood, organs removed, like a gift. That night I called a family meeting. "We're leaving," I announced. "First thing tomorrow." No one argued. The kids looked relieved. Even Rose, who loved this house more than anyone, nodded firmly. "What about the farm, the tobacco?" Harold asked. "Not worth our lives," I said. "Something's hunting us, playing with us. I won't wait to find out what it wants." We packed what we could carry, left most of the furniture, the farm equipment, even most of the children's toys, loaded 2 trucks and Harold's car. By noon the next day we were gone, headed for my brother's place in Louisville. I never went back, not even for our belongings. Sent a lawyer to sell the property as is. Lost money on the deal, but gained our peace of mind. The new owners lasted 3 months before they too fled. Sometimes I wonder what that thing was. Not a man, not an animal, something else. Something that could skin animals without spilling blood, that could speak inside a person's head, that watched us with those 2 human eyes. The Green River area still has stories about the Spotsville monster. Some say it's still there, still hunting. I don't know. Don't want to know. All I know is that for 11 months in 1975 and 1976, my family faced a terror I can't explain. We survived because we ran, because we admitted there are things in this world beyond understanding, beyond fighting. The farm on Mount Ridge Road stands empty to this day. Land's gone back to wilderness. Locals won't go near it after dark. Smart folks, those locals. They know some places belong to things older and stranger than us. Things that will let you stay a while watching you, studying you, until they don't want you there anymore. And when that happens, you'd best leave while you still can. Story 14. I'd been watching the forecast all week. Perfect fishing weather was coming. Cool, cloudy with a bit of mist. It was September 2018, and I'd been itching to try my luck at the Lawrence County stream, where I'd caught some decent-sized trout the previous spring. Living in Youngtown, Ohio, meant I had to drive about an hour and a half to get there, but it was worth it for the solitude and the fishing. The alarm blared at 4 a.m. I rolled out of bed, excited despite the early hour. My gear was already packed and waiting by the door: rod, tackle box, waders, net, and a small cooler with sandwiches and water. I loaded everything into my pickup, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and hit the road while the rest of the neighborhood was still fast asleep. The drive was peaceful. Highway lights gave way to darkness as I left the city behind. I rolled down the window a crack, letting the cool air keep me alert. The roads got narrower, the trees thicker, and by the time I turned onto the gravel access road leading to the fishing spot, I was completely surrounded by forest. It was just past 5:30 a.m. when I pulled into the small dirt parking area. The fog was thicker than I'd expected, a proper blanket that hovered about chest high through the trees. My headlights cut through it in an eerie way, but I felt a surge of satisfaction when I saw there were no other vehicles. The stream would be all mine. I killed the engine and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately, that deep, cushioned quiet you only get in the woods. No traffic noise, no human voices, just the occasional drip of moisture from the trees and the distant sound of the stream. I suited up, pulling on my waders and vest, assembling my rod, and checking my gear one last time before heading down the trail. The path to the stream was slick with dew and fog moisture. My boots left clear tracks in the matted leaves. The tree branches reached overhead like skeletal fingers, occasionally dropping cold water down my neck. But these were familiar discomforts, part of the experience I'd come for. I reached the stream after about 10 minutes of careful walking. The water looked perfect, clear despite the surrounding fog, flowing at a good pace, but not too fast. I could make out the deeper pools where trout might be holding. The first spot I tried was a wide pool with a fallen log, creating a nice current break. I waded in carefully, feeling the cold water press against my waders. For the next hour, I worked that pool methodically, trying different flies and techniques, but got nothing. Not even a nibble. Sometimes that's just how fishing goes. I decided to move upstream to a deeper section I remembered from my last trip. It was a bit more remote, requiring a short hike through denser woods alongside the stream, but often held bigger fish. The fog hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it seemed thicker now, reducing visibility to maybe 40 yards in any direction. The second spot was even prettier than I remembered. The stream narrowed and deepened, with large boulders creating perfect holding water for trout. I waded in carefully, found a stable position on a flat rock, and began casting. I was about 20 minutes into fishing this new spot when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A rock sailed through the branches about 100 feet upstream from me. I heard it clearly, the rustle through leaves, a sharp crack as it hit a tree trunk, then a thud as it fell to the ground. I paused mid-cast, listening. Probably just a squirrel dropping something, I thought. Or maybe a branch giving way under the weight of collected moisture. I returned to my fishing, making a nice cast toward a promising eddy. 20 or 30 seconds later, I heard it again. Another stone following almost exactly the same path, through branches, hitting wood, then falling. This time I stared hard in that direction, but the fog made it impossible to see anything beyond the closest trees. "Hello," I called out, wondering if another fisherman had wandered in. No response. I kept fishing, but now I was paying more attention to the woods than my line. Within the next 5 minutes, 10 to 12 more rocks sailed through the air. They weren't being thrown at me. They all landed about 35 yards away, but the pattern was undeniable. Something was tossing those rocks. "Hey, is someone there?" I called again, louder this time. Only the soft gurgle of the stream answered. I'm not easily spooked. I've fished alone in remote areas for years, encountered black bears, coyotes, and all sorts of wildlife. But this felt different. The deliberate, patterned nature of the rock throwing unnerved me. Still, I wasn't about to abandon a prime fishing spot because of some strange sounds. The trout were likely there, just waiting for the right presentation. I made another cast, watching my fly drift naturally along the current. That's when it hit me. There's no other way to describe it except as an electrical current running through my entire body. Every hair stood up, not just on my arms or neck, but everywhere. My skin crawled with a sensation I'd never experienced before. But worse than the physical feeling was the sudden, overwhelming panic that flooded my system. I'd never felt fear like this, not when I nearly drove off a mountain road in a snowstorm, not when I discovered that copperhead in my woodpile. This was primal, bypassing all rational thought. Every cell in my body screamed, "Danger!" I didn't think. I just moved. I turned and splashed downstream, not caring about making noise or spooking fish. My wading boots slipped on algae-covered rocks, and I nearly went down twice but managed to stay upright. The cold water sloshed against my waders as I half ran, half stumbled through the stream. After about 50 yards, I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing was visibly pursuing me, but that didn't diminish the panic still coursing through my system. I continued downstream until I reached a spot where the bank wasn't too steep. I scrambled up, rod in one hand, the other grabbing at roots and rocks for purchase. Once on solid ground, I pushed through brush and briars, ignoring the scratches on my hands and the branches whipping my face. I took the most direct route back to the parking area, not caring about the established trail. My truck was still the only vehicle there. I threw my rod in the back without breaking it down and climbed into the cab, locking the doors automatically. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. I reversed in a spray of gravel and didn't slow down until I reached the main road. It was only then, with 10 miles between me and that stream, that my heart rate began to normalize. I realized I'd left my tackle box and net behind. There was no way I was going back for them. That night, back home in Youngtown, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rock throwing, followed by that inexplicable fear. There had to be an explanation. I fired up my laptop and began searching. The first useful information I found was about primates. Chimpanzees and other apes throw rocks as warning signals to intruders in their territory. The rocks I'd heard weren't aimed at me, they were landing consistently in the same area, creating a boundary line of sorts. A warning. But Ohio doesn't have wild primates. At least it's not supposed to. I kept searching and came across something that made my blood run cold. Infrasound, very low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing. Certain animals can produce these waves: elephants, whales, alligators. And these sound waves can induce exactly what I experienced: fear, panic, anxiety, and physical sensations like hair standing on end and skin crawling. I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading everything I could find, and that's when I ended up on websites about Bigfoot encounters. I'd never given much credence to Bigfoot stories. They were campfire tales, nothing more. But as I read account after account describing experiences eerily similar to mine, I couldn't dismiss them so easily. Rock throwing as territorial warnings, the use of infrasound to induce panic in humans who didn't heed initial warnings, the overwhelming urge to flee. It all matched. As I read, other memories from previous fishing trips to that same area surfaced, things I'd dismissed or rationalized at the time. Last spring, I'd found an X-shaped formation of sticks that hadn't been there when I'd fished the same spot 2 days earlier. The sticks were too large to have been moved by wind or water, and they were deliberately placed, crossing each other at the center. And the previous fall, I'd witnessed half a dozen deer splashing frantically through the creek, eyes wide with terror. At the time, I'd assumed they were fleeing from hunters or perhaps a mountain lion. Now I wondered if they'd encountered the same thing I had. I checked maps of Lawrence County, looking at the area surrounding that stream. It was more remote than I'd realized, connecting to thousands of acres of rarely traversed woodland. Plenty of space for something to remain hidden, especially something intelligent enough to avoid human contact. 3 weeks passed before I worked up the courage to return for my abandoned gear. This time, I brought my buddy Mac. We arrived mid-morning on a clear day, no fog, full visibility. "You sure this is where you left it?" Mac asked as we reached the stream. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in ages." He was right. The bank showed no signs of recent human presence, but I recognized the spot. "It's here somewhere," I insisted. "Let's look around." We found my tackle box and net after about 20 minutes of searching. They weren't where I thought I'd left them, but rather placed neatly on a flat rock near the water's edge, as if someone or something had collected and arranged them there. Max saw my expression. "What's wrong? We found your stuff." "I didn't leave them like that," I said quietly. "Probably another fisherman found them and put them somewhere visible," he suggested. "Maybe," I agreed, but I didn't believe it. The tackle box was closed when I distinctly remembered leaving it open next to where I'd been fishing. And it had been moved at least 50 yards from that spot. We didn't stay long after that. On the hike back to the truck, I kept scanning the woods, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. Mac noticed. "You used to love it out here," he said. "What happened?" I couldn't explain it to him. How do you tell someone that you believe you encountered a creature most people think is mythical? That it warned you away by throwing rocks, and then when you didn't leave, hit you with some kind of fear-inducing sound wave? He'd think I was crazy. Just got spooked last time I was here, I said. Bad case of the willies. Well, nothing here now except squirrels and birds, Max said cheerfully. But as we neared the parking area, I noticed something I hadn't seen on the way in. A large, twisted oak with a peculiar marking on its trunk. A series of deep gouges in the bark, too high for a bear and too organized to be random. They formed a crude X, similar to the stick formation I'd found before. I stopped and stared at it. Mac walked on, not noticing. That was the last time I fished that stream. Call it superstition or instinct, but something in those woods had marked its territory, and I'd been warned twice now. I wasn't going to ignore a third warning. These days I fish the lake near Youngtown. It's more crowded, the fish are smaller, and there's always the buzz of jet skis in the background. But I'll take that over the alternative. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I feel the hairs on my arms start to rise. And I wonder if what I encountered that foggy September morning might have followed me home, or if the fear it planted in me will simply never leave. Story 15. The December chill bit through my hunting jacket as I trudged through the fresh snow in Pike County. The date was December 17th, 1974. I remember it clear as day. I was 19, cocky as hell, and thought I knew these woods better than anyone. My name's Eddie Tanner, and I was checking my fox traps like I did every morning before heading to my shift at the sawmill. The snow had fallen steady through the night, about 3 inches of powder coating everything in white. It made tracking easy, which is why I noticed them right away. I'd been walking the edge of Bill Henson's pasture field, right where it butts up against that stand of pine trees, when I stopped dead in my tracks. Footprints. Human-looking footprints. Barefoot human footprints in December snow. I crouched down and placed my gloved hand next to one. The print dwarfed my hand, had to be 16, maybe 18 inches long. 5 toes, clearly visible, pressed deep into the snow. The stride between them stretched way longer than any man could step. What the hell? I muttered, looking around. Nobody in their right mind would be out here barefoot in December. The temperature sat at 28 degrees. Your feet would freeze solid in minutes. I touched the inside of one print. The snow was loose, not compacted or icy. These tracks were minutes old, maybe less. The light snowfall continuing to drift down had barely begun to fill them in. I stood up and tried to match the stride between prints. No way. I had to leap to reach from one to the next, and even then I barely made it. Whatever made these had a stride twice as long as mine, and I stood 5'11". Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks, my fox traps temporarily forgotten. The trail led straight toward the fence, separating Henson's pasture from the miller's property. I expected to see where whatever made them had climbed over. There was nothing. The tracks continued on the other side with the same stride length. The thing had simply stepped over a 4-foot fence without breaking stride or disturbing the top wire. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't right. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for this distance, and they sure as hell don't have feet that look this human. A man couldn't make these strides or step over fences like they weren't there. I checked my watch. I had to get to work or Jim Yates would have my ass. But I marked the location in my mind. I'd be back. All day at the sawmill, I couldn't focus. The image of those massive footprints kept flashing in my mind. Jim yelled at me twice for not paying attention. By the time my shift ended at 4:30, daylight was already fading. I raced home, grabbed my Winchester Magnum rifle, and drove my beat-up Ford truck back to Henson's field. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped. The tracks remained visible, though slightly more filled with snow than earlier. I followed them across the miller's land and into the woods beyond. The forest grew dense here, pine and oak, creating shadows that deepened with the setting sun. I switched on my flashlight, following the tracks by its yellow beam. After 15 minutes, I reached Beaver Creek. The tracks led right to the water's edge, disappeared into the shallow stream, and emerged on the far bank. As I crossed the creek, I noticed something in the mud of the opposite bank, a handprint. A goddamn handprint where whatever made those tracks had put its hand down to climb up the bank. I placed my hand next to it. The print was more than twice the size of my own, with 5 distinct finger marks pressed into the cold mud. Each finger was thick, the palm wide and heavy. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight. My mouth went dry. The scale of this thing, the height, the weight it would take to make prints this deep, it had to be massive. I kept following. The tracks led across 3 more fields, through a patch of woods, and finally to County Road 22. There, on the gravel shoulder, the tracks disappeared. Whatever made them had either walked down the road or crossed to the other side where the ground was harder. Darkness had fully settled in. My flashlight beam seemed weak against the growing shadows. The hairs on my neck stood up. For the first time, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I was tracking something I couldn't identify, something big enough to leave tracks a bear would envy. And now I had no idea where it had gone. I hurried back to my truck, rifle clutched tight, checking over my shoulder every few steps. A week passed. I'd gone back to check the area twice more, but found no fresh tracks. The old ones had melted away in a brief, warm spell. I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, exaggerated the size in my mind. Then my cousin Tommy stopped by. We were sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee when he mentioned something strange. "You hear about the Parker boys? Shot at a bear over at their place last Tuesday." The Parkers lived about 2 miles from where I'd lost the tracks. Their farm backed up against the state forest. "A bear? In December?" I asked. Black bears were uncommon in Pike County, even in summer. In winter, they should be denned up. That's what their daddy's saying. But bears don't stand 8 feet tall, last I checked. I nearly choked on my coffee. "What did you say?" "The boys say they shot at something huge looking over their cattle pen fence. Their dad says it was a bear, but they're saying different when he's not around." I drove over to the Parker place that afternoon. Mr. Parker wasn't home, but the 2 boys were in the barn. Billy was 12, his brother Jimmy 10. Both had that scrappy look of farm kids, dirt perpetually embedded under their fingernails. "Heard you boys had some excitement," I said casually, leaning against the barn door. Billy looked at Jimmy, then back at me. "Dad says we ain't supposed to talk about it no more." "Says it was just a black bear," Jimmy added, but his voice had that high pitch kids get when they're repeating something they don't believe. "I ain't gonna tell your dad we talked," I assured them. "Just curious what you actually saw." Billy hesitated, then put down the hay fork he was holding. "It wasn't no bear. Bears got snouts. This thing had a face. Flat, like a person, but not a person." "How big was it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Big as the roof of the chicken coop," Jimmy blurted. "It was just standing there, looking over the fence at our cattle. I thought it was going to take a calf." Billy nodded. "Its head was higher than the fence top, way higher. Dad thinks we're making it up, but we both saw it. I grabbed Granddad's shotgun off the wall and fired at it. It ran off into the trees." "Can you show me where it was standing?" I asked. The boys led me out to the cattle pen. The fence stood 6 feet high. Billy pointed to the back corner, where the forest crept close to the property line. "It was right there, just watching the cows. Its arms were longer than a person's. It had dark hair all over, but not like a bear's, more like a person with real hairy arms." I walked to the spot and examined the ground. The recent thaw had erased any tracks, but I noticed something else. The side of the barn faced this corner of the fence. On its white-painted boards, about 8 or 9 feet up, was a pattern of small dents and chips in the paint. "That from your shotgun?" I asked, pointing. Billy nodded. "Dad was mad about that. Said I shouldn't be firing so close to the barn." "That's 9 feet up," I said quietly. "No bear stands that tall." Jimmy's eyes widened. "See? Told you it wasn't no bear." I didn't have the heart to tell them what I suspected. Hell, I barely wanted to admit it to myself. But those dents in the barn wall, combined with the tracks I'd found, something unnatural was prowling these woods. January rolled in with a vengeance. 2 weeks of bitter cold and heavy snow kept me close to home except for work shifts. But by late January, the weather broke enough for me to get back to my fox trapping. The territory where I'd seen the tracks was prime for red fox, and I wasn't about to surrender my best trapping ground to fear. I went out before dawn on a Saturday, my Winchester slung over my shoulder. I'd set 6 traps the evening before along the edge of the pine stand near Henson's pasture. The morning was cold but clear, stars still visible in the pre-dawn sky. I checked the first 4 traps, empty. The 5th held a nice male fox, already dead from the cold. I reset the trap after collecting my prize. 1 more to check. The last trap was set further into the trees than the others. As I approached, the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. The woods remained dark, though, the pines blocking what little light filtered down. I was 20 yards from the trap when I heard it. A scream, not human, not animal, something in between. It started as a low moan, then rose to a pitch that froze the blood in my veins. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. I dropped the fox and raised my rifle, spinning in a circle, trying to locate the source. The sound came again, this time transforming into a howl that no creature I knew could make. It was deep, powerful, with a resonance that vibrated in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, immediately regretting making noise. Silence answered me, then a sound like wood striking wood, knock, knock, from deeper in the forest. A clear, deliberate sound, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. I backed away, keeping my rifle ready. Another sound came from my right, a high, whistling note that no bird makes in January. It was mimicking a whippoorwill, but wrong somehow, too loud and sustained. Fear gripped me then, real primal fear. My hands shook on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to back away slowly, scanning the trees. A rock sailed past my head, missing by inches. It wasn't thrown from the direction of the knocking or the whistle, but from behind me. Something was circling me, staying just out of sight in the dim pre-dawn light. I broke then, turned and ran. Crashed through the underbrush, abandoning my fox, my last trap, everything but my rifle. Behind me, that howl rose again, followed by crashing sounds, something big moving through the forest faster than I could. I burst into the open field and sprinted for my truck, parked a quarter-mile away. The crashing sound stopped at the forest edge. It wouldn't follow into the open, not with dawn breaking. I reached my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I peeled out, gravel flying, and didn't slow down until I hit the main road. I didn't go back to those woods for a month, told people I had the flu. When I finally returned to check my abandoned traps, I went in broad daylight with Tommy and his hunting dogs. We found nothing unusual, just my rusted traps and the decayed remains of the fox I'd dropped. Tommy thought I was crazy, or that someone had played a prank on me, but those dogs wouldn't enter the pine stand. They whined and tucked their tails, refusing to follow commands. Dogs know things we don't. Over the years, I heard other stories from around Pike County, hunters reporting strange howls, livestock acting spooked for no reason, tracks found in mud or snow, then dismissed as hoaxes. I kept quiet about what I'd seen and heard. Didn't want to be known as the local nut job. Then, 15 years later in 1989, I was watching television late one night. Some show about unexplained phenomena. They played an audio recording labeled The Ohio Howl. captured by researchers near Wellsville, over on the eastern side of the state. The sound that came through my TV speakers made me drop my beer. The same unearthly howl, the exact same sound I'd heard that January morning. They called the creature Bigfoot. I sat there, beer soaking into my carpet. As decades of doubt washed away, I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't exaggerated. What I'd encountered in Pike County was real, and others had encountered it too. I never went back to check traps alone after that January morning. Never went into those woods near dusk or dawn without company. I still hunt, still trap, but always with a partner, always with respect for what might be watching from the tree line. Those tracks in the December snow changed something in me, made me understand that the world is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than we want to admit. The forests hide things we've forgotten how to see, ancient things that watch us from the shadows. Sometimes at night I still hear that howl in my dreams, still see those massive footprints stretching across virgin snow, still feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking my movements. And I know with absolute certainty that I was not the last person to encounter the creature that walks Pike County woods on feet that leave 18-inch tracks in the snow.